Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete and peaceful journey through the extraordinary life of Athelstan, the first true king of England, whose remarkable reign from 924 to 939 would forge the very foundations of the English nation. We know today we'll softly explore the mysterious circumstances of his birth in the shadow of Viking invasions around 894, his remarkable education under the watchful eye of his grandfather Alfred the Great, his patient rise to power despite fierce opposition, and his brilliant conquest of York that made him the first Anglo-Saxon ruler of all England. Our gentle tale will carry us through his diplomatic triumphs over Welsh and Scottish kings, his bold invasion of Scotland that shook the northern kingdoms, and his supreme victory at the legendary Battle of Brunanburh, the greatest military encounter in Anglo-Saxon history. In the peaceful hours that follow, we'll discover how this warrior king transformed into a scholar and patron of learning, building a court that rivaled the greatest centers of medieval Europe. We'll witness his obsession with collecting sacred relics from across Christendom, his revolutionary legal reforms that shaped English law for centuries, and his creation of the first truly imperial government in post-Roman Britain. From his mysterious birth as the contested son of Edward the Elder, through his apprenticeship in the reconquest of Danish England, to his emergence as Rex Totius Britanniae, king of all Britain, this is the complete story of the man who united a divided land and created the England that would outlive empires and inspire the world. Before you drift away into peaceful slumber, for this extended journey through 1,000 years of history, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a gentle comment about what fascinates you most about Anglo-Saxon England, and subscribe to keep these soothing historical tales coming your way. So settle in comfortably, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from over a millennium ago carry you through the night toward restful sleep. We have many peaceful hours ahead of us in the company of England's first king, and if you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. Athelstan, later known as the first king of England, entered this world sometime in the year 893 or 894, during one of the most turbulent periods in British history. His birth occurred not in the peaceful chambers of a secure palace, but in a realm constantly threatened by Viking raids, political upheaval, and the ever-present possibility that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms might crumble entirely before foreign invasion. The very name bestowed upon this future king carried prophetic weight, drawn from the ancient Germanic language that his ancestors had brought across the North Sea centuries earlier. Athelstan combined two powerful concepts, meaning noble or aristocratic, and stan, meaning stone. Together, they proclaimed this child to be a noble stone, solid, enduring, unbreakable, and destined to serve as a foundation upon which great things might be built. In the dangerous world of 9th century Britain, such a name was both aspiration and prayer. Yet the circumstances surrounding Athelstan's birth were shrouded in mystery and controversy that would follow him throughout his life. His father was Edward, son of the great King Alfred of Wessex, a prince who had proven himself in battle against the Danes, and who seemed destined to inherit his father's crown. But the identity of Athelstan's mother remains one of the most puzzling questions in Anglo-Saxon history. Later chroniclers, writing long after the events they described, would name her a Gwynna, woman about whom virtually nothing else is known. She appears in no contemporary documents, receives no mention in the surviving letters or charters of her supposed era, and leaves no trace in the careful genealogies that Anglo-Saxon kings used to establish their legitimacy. Some historians have suggested that she was Edward's first wife, legally married according to the customs of the time. Others have argued that she was merely a concubine, her relationship with the future king politically convenient, but canonically irregular. This uncertainty about his mother's status would plague Athelstan throughout his youth and early reign. In an age where legitimacy of birth could determine the fate of kingdoms, where the difference between legitimate and bastard might mean the difference between a crown and an early grave, questions about Egwin's status provided powerful ammunition for those who opposed Athelstan's eventual rise to power. Some would whisper that the future king was born of an irregular union, making him unsuitable for the throne. Others would defend his legitimacy with equal fervor, creating a controversy that would simmer for decades. What is certain is that Athelstan was Edward's eldest son, the first fruit of his father's loins, and therefore heir to all the expectations and burdens that such a position entailed. He was born into the royal house of Wessex, at a time when that kingdom stood as the last major Anglo-Saxon bastion against Danish conquest, when the very survival of English Christianity and culture hung in the balance. To understand the magnitude of Athelstan's eventual achievement, we must first journey back through the mists of time to witness the world into which he was born, a world so different from our own that it seems almost mythical in its violence and uncertainty. For nearly 4 centuries, from the conquest of Emperor Claudius in 43 AD to the early 5th century, Britain had rested secure under the protective wing of Roman imperial power. The great legions had marched along roads that stretched from Hadrian's Wall in the north to the ports of Dover in the south, carrying the twin messages of Roman civilization: submit to imperial authority and enjoy the peace and prosperity that submission brought. Roman Britain had been a land of cities and villas, of forums where merchants haggled in Latin, and amphitheatres where gladiators died for the entertainment of Romanized Britons. Bath had been a resort town where wealthy Romans soaked in natural hot springs while discussing philosophy and politics. London Londinium, to its Roman inhabitants, had been a thriving commercial centre where goods from across the empire changed hands in markets protected by massive stone walls. But empires, however mighty, are not eternal. By the opening years of the 5th century, as Gothic warriors ravaged Italy and Vandal fleets terrorized the Mediterranean, Rome found herself unable to defend her far-flung provinces. In 410 AD, the last Roman legions marched to their ships at Dover and sailed away, leaving behind a Romanized Celtic population suddenly and terrifyingly alone. The withdrawal of Roman protection created a vacuum that nature abhors and politics cannot tolerate. The Romanized Britons, grown soft after 4 centuries of imperial security, found themselves defenseless against the fierce Picts who swept down from Scotland and the Irish raiders who struck along the western coasts. In desperation, some British kings made a fateful decision that would change the course of history. They invited Germanic mercenaries to help defend their lands. The invitation went out to the warrior peoples of the North Sea coastlands, Angles from the peninsula that still bears their name in modern Denmark, the Saxons from the marshy lowlands of northwestern Germany, and the mysterious Jutes, whose exact origins remain debated by scholars. These were not the civilized peoples of the Roman world, but warrior societies where a man's worth was measured by his skill with sword and spear, where kings ruled by the consent of armed retainers, and where the greatest honor was to die gloriously. In battle, what began as mercenary service gradually transformed into conquest and settlement. The Germanic warriors, having seen the wealth and weakness of post-Roman Britain, began bringing their families across the North Sea. They established their own kingdoms, imposed their own laws, and gradually pushed the native British population westward into the mountains of Wales and the southwestern peninsula of Cornwall. By the 6th century, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms dominated most of what would become England. Wessex controlled the south and southwest. Mercia held sway over the Midlands. Northumbria stretched from the Humber River to the Scottish border. East Anglia encompassed the eastern regions that the Romans had called the Kingdom of the Iceni. Each of these realms had its own king, its own laws, its own dialect of the Anglo-Saxon tongue, and its own ambitions for expansion at the expense of its neighbors. For 3 centuries, these Anglo-Saxon kingdoms rose and fell in an endless cycle of conquest and defeat. Mercia dominated the 8th century under kings like Uffa, who built the great earthwork dike that still marks the border between England and Wales. Northumbria produced scholars like the Venerable Bede, whose histories would preserve the memory of these tumultuous times for future generations. Wessex gradually emerged as a major power in the south, expanding its territory through a combination of military conquest and diplomatic marriage. But even as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fought among themselves for supremacy, a new and terrible threat was gathering beyond the horizon. Across the North Sea, in the fjords and forests of Scandinavia, warrior peoples were preparing to launch the greatest seaborne assault in European history. The first sign of the coming storm appeared on June 8, 793, when Viking longships swept out of the dawn mist to strike the monastery of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast. The attack sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world, not just because of its ferocity, but because it targeted one of the most sacred sites in Anglo-Saxon England. Lindisfarne was where St. Cuthbert had lived and prayed, where the magnificent illuminated Gospels had been created, where generations of monks had preserved learning and faith through the darkest periods of the early Middle Ages. The destruction of Lindisfarne was not an isolated incident, but the opening act of a campaign that would reshape the map of Europe. Viking fleets struck at monasteries along the coasts of Ireland, Scotland, and England, carrying away treasures that had been accumulated over centuries and enslaving monks, whose only crime had been their devotion to God. But as the 9th century progressed, these raids evolved into something far more dangerous: systematic conquest and colonization. The turning point came in 865, with the arrival of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the Great Heathen Army, a massive Viking coalition, led by the sons of the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok. This was not a raiding party, but an invasion force, equipped and organized for permanent conquest. The Great Heathen Army swept through East Anglia like a wildfire, killing the last native king and establishing Viking rule over the entire region. From there, they moved north into Northumbria, capturing York and ending forever the independence of the kingdom that had once produced saints and scholars. Mercia, the mightiest of the Anglo-Saxon realms, proved unable to resist the Viking onslaught. King Burgard fled into exile, leaving his kingdom to be divided between Viking settlers and Anglo-Saxon collaborators. By 878, only Wessex remained as an independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom, and even Wessex seemed doomed when the Viking king, Guthrum, launched a winter assault that drove King Alfred into hiding in the Somerset marshes. It was against this background of catastrophe and near extinction that Alfred the Great Athelstan's grandfather mounted his desperate counterattack. From his refuge in the marshes of Athelney, Alfred gathered the scattered remnants of West Saxon resistance and launched the campaign that would culminate in his great victory at Edington in May 878. The Battle of Edington was far more than a military triumph. It was the salvation of Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred's victory forced Guthrum to accept baptism as a Christian and to withdraw his forces from Wessex. But more importantly, it demonstrated that the Vikings were not invincible. For the first time since the arrival of the Great Heathen Army, an Anglo-Saxon king had defeated a major Viking force in open battle. Yet Alfred's triumph at Edington, crucial though it was, did not end the Viking threat. The peace treaty that followed the battle divided England along the old Roman road called Watling Street, with Alfred controlling Wessex and western Mercia, while Guthrum and his followers ruled the eastern regions that would become known as the Danelaw. It was a compromise born of mutual exhaustion rather than total victory, and both sides understood that the conflict would eventually resume. Alfred the Great was far more than a successful military commander. He was a visionary king who understood that lasting victory required more than battlefield triumphs. In the quarter century that followed Edington, he transformed Wessex from a vulnerable kingdom into the strongest power in Anglo-Saxon England, laying the foundations upon which his successors would build a unified English nation. His first concern was defense. Alfred understood that the Vikings had succeeded largely because they could move faster than their Anglo-Saxon enemies, striking from their ships before defenders could react and disappearing back across the sea before retaliation became possible. To counter this mobility, Alfred initiated the construction of a network of fortified towns called burhs, each positioned no more than 20 miles from its neighbors, so that no part of Wessex was more than a day's march from safety. These burhs were more than military installations. They became centers of trade and administration that helped bind Wessex together as a unified realm. Winchester, the ancient capital, was strengthened and expanded. New fortifications rose at strategic points throughout the kingdom. Each burh was garrisoned by local thanes who owed military service to the crown, creating a defensive system that could respond rapidly to Viking attacks while providing secure bases for Alfred's own offensive operations. But Alfred's vision extended far beyond military reform. He understood that the Vikings had succeeded partly because the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had become intellectually and spiritually weak, their courts dominated by warriors who could fight but could not read, their churches served by priests who barely understood the Latin prayers they recited. If Wessex was to survive and prosper, it needed to reclaim the learning and culture that had once made Anglo-Saxon England a beacon of civilization. Alfred, therefore, inaugurated what historians have called the Alfredian Renaissance, a systematic effort to restore learning and literacy to his kingdom. He established schools where young nobles could learn to read and write in both English and Latin. He imported scholars from across Europe, offering them generous patronage to serve at his court and teach his subjects. Most remarkably of all, he undertook the translation of major Latin works into English, making the wisdom of the past accessible to nobles who had never mastered the classical language. Among the works Alfred translated were Boethius's Consolation. Of philosophy, Pope Gregory's Pastoral Care, and Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. Each translation was accompanied by Alfred's own commentary, revealing a king who was not merely a patron of learning but a genuine intellectual in his own right. The preface to his translation of Pastoral Care includes one of the most moving passages in Anglo-Saxon literature, as Alfred laments the decay of learning that had preceded his reign and expresses his determination to restore his kingdom's intellectual greatness. Alfred also initiated the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the remarkable record of English history that would continue to be maintained for centuries after his death. Unlike the dry annals kept by most medieval kingdoms, the Chronicle was written in vernacular English and was clearly intended to foster a sense of English identity that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms. Through the Chronicle, the scattered peoples of Anglo-Saxon England could see themselves as part of a single nation with a shared history and common destiny. Perhaps most importantly for our story, Alfred's court became a place where young nobles from across Anglo-Saxon England could receive the education and experience necessary for future leadership. It was here that his son Edward learned the arts of kingship, and it was here that his grandson Athelstan would receive the attention and training that would shape his entire life. The relationship between Alfred and his eldest grandson appears to have been extraordinarily close. According to William of Malmesbury, writing in the 12th century but drawing on sources that are now lost, Alfred took a special interest in Athelstan that went far beyond normal familial affection. When the boy was still very young, perhaps no more than 4 or 5 years old, Alfred summoned him to participate in a ceremony that would resonate throughout Athelstan's life. The great hall of Winchester was ablaze with torches on the night when Alfred the Great chose to mark his grandson's future in a way that no one present would ever forget. The year was probably 898 or 899, making Athelstan a small child of perhaps 5 summers, yet old enough to understand that something extraordinary was taking place. The court had assembled in full ceremonial splendor. The greatest nobles of Wessex stood in attendance, their golden arm rings and ornate sword hilts catching the flickering light of the torches that lined the walls. Bishops and abbots had come from the kingdom's most important monasteries, their rich vestments providing a counterpoint to the martial display of the assembled thanes. At the center of it all sat Alfred himself, wearing the simple crown that symbolized his authority over the West Saxons and those Mercians who acknowledged his overlordship. Into this solemn assembly came young Athelstan, probably led by one of the senior nobles who served as his guardians. The boy must have been overwhelmed by the grandeur of the occasion, by the sea of faces watching his every move, by the weight of expectation that seemed to fill the very air around him. Alfred rose from his throne and approached his grandson, carrying with him gifts that would have seemed magnificent even in an age accustomed to royal splendor. The first was a cloak of scarlet wool, its rich crimson dye speaking of wealth and status that few could afford. Scarlet was the color of royalty and high nobility, reserved for those of the highest rank and greatest honor. As Alfred draped the cloak around his grandson's small shoulders, he was clothing the boy not just in fabric but in the visible symbols of future greatness. Next came a belt adorned with precious gems, each stone carefully selected and set by the finest craftsmen. In the kingdom, the belt was not merely decorative but functional, designed to support the weight of the weapons that every noble was expected to carry. As Alfred fastened the belt around Athelstan's waist, he was symbolically preparing the boy for the warrior's life that awaited him. But the most significant gift was yet to come. Alfred presented his grandson with a sword knot, a toy weapon scaled for a child's use, but a real blade with a golden scabbard that gleamed in the torchlight. The sword was a symbol of power, authority, and the right to command other men in battle. In Anglo-Saxon culture, no gift could carry greater significance or convey a clearer message about the recipient's future role. As the ceremony concluded and the assembled nobles offered their acclamations, everyone present understood that they had witnessed something unprecedented. Never before had an Anglo-Saxon king marked out his grandson in such a public and dramatic fashion. The gifts themselves spoke of royal favor, but the ceremony went beyond mere generosity to suggest something approaching designation as an heir modern. Historians have debated the meaning of Alfred's ceremony for decades. Some see it as evidence that the great king had lost confidence in his son Edward and intended to pass the crown directly to his grandson. Others interpret it more cautiously, viewing the gifts as a form of symbolic adoption that raised Athelstan's status without necessarily promising him the throne. The mystery is deepened by the existence of a remarkable poem written around this time by one of Alfred's court scholars, John the Old Saxon. The poem is an acrostic with the first letters of each line spelling out Athelstan, a variant form of Athelstan's name. The verses themselves prophesy a glorious future for the young prince, playing on the meaning of his name to suggest that he will indeed prove to be a noble stone. upon which great achievements will be built. The poem's language is dense with biblical and classical allusions, suggesting that it was composed by someone with considerable learning who had access to the royal court and its scholarly resources. Some historians believe that John wrote the poem specifically to commemorate Alfred's ceremony, while others argue that it was composed later to celebrate Athelstan's actual achievements as king. Whatever its exact date, the poem provides evidence that Athelstan's potential for greatness was recognized from a very early age. Perhaps most intriguingly, the ceremony may have been connected to a succession crisis that was brewing within the royal family. Alfred's nephew, Thelfeld, son of Alfred's older brother, Thelhard, had never abandoned his claim to the throne of Wessex. According to Anglo-Saxon law and custom, Thelfeld's claim was arguably superior to that of Alfred's direct descendants, since he was the son of an elder brother. By publicly marking out his grandson as a potential heir, Alfred may have been attempting to strengthen his family's position against future challenges. The gifts bestowed by Alfred were not merely symbolic, they marked the beginning of an education designed to prepare Athelstan for the awesome responsibilities of kingship. In the world of late 9th century England, a king needed to be many things: a skilled warrior capable of leading men into battle, a wise judge who could settle disputes and maintain justice, a diplomat who could navigate the treacherous waters of international politics, and increasingly, a scholar who could read and write and engage with the intellectual traditions of Christian Europe. Athelstan's education began, as it did for all noble children of his era, with the fundamental skills of literacy and numeracy. In Alfred's court, this meant learning to read and write not just in English but also in Latin, the language of the church and of international diplomacy. The boy would have studied the Psalms and other biblical texts, absorbing both the spiritual content and the grammatical structures that would enable him to compose his own documents in later years. But intellectual education was only part of the preparation for kingship. Athelstan also needed to master the martial arts that would keep him alive in an age of constant warfare. He learned to handle sword and spear, to fight both on foot and on horseback, to understand the tactics and strategy that could mean the difference between victory and defeat. Most importantly, he learned the art of leadership, how to inspire men to follow him into battle, how to maintain discipline in the ranks, how to make the split-second decisions upon which battles and kingdoms could turn. Perhaps most crucially, Athelstan learned these skills not in the comfortable environment of his grandfather's court, but in the harder school of active campaigning. Contemporary sources suggest that he spent much of his youth with his aunt Thelfeld, the remarkable woman known to history as the Lady of the Mercians. Thelfeld was Alfred's daughter and Edward's sister, but she was far more than just a royal relative. Married to Tellard, the Lord of the Mercians, she had become the effective ruler of Mercia when her husband fell seriously ill around 909. Upon his death 2 years later, she assumed full control of the kingdom and proved herself one of the most capable military commanders of her generation. Under Ethelflaed's tutelage, young Athelstan witnessed the reality of the reconquest that his grandfather had begun. He saw how his aunt combined military pressure with diplomatic negotiation to extend Mercian control over territories that had been lost to the Danes decades earlier. He watched as new fortresses burhs in the Anglo-Saxon tongue were constructed to secure conquered lands and provide bases for further advances. Most importantly, he learned that successful kingship required not just personal courage, but also the ability to coordinate complex military and political operations across vast distances. The campaigns of the 910s provided the perfect classroom for a future king. Working in close coordination with her brother Edward, Thelfeld launched a systematic assault on Danish power in the English Midlands. The strategy was methodical rather than dramatic, instead of seeking a single great battle that might end the war. The Anglo-Saxon commanders chose to advance step by step, consolidating each gain before moving forward to the next objective. The first major success came in 917 with the capture of Derby, one of the 5 great fortified towns that formed the backbone of Danish power in the Midlands. The assault on Derby required careful planning and coordination between Mercian and West Saxon forces, demonstrating the kind of inter-kingdom cooperation that would become a hallmark of Athelstan's later reign. Derby's fall was followed in rapid succession by the submission of Leicester, Stamford, Nottingham, and finally Lincoln, the last of the great Danish strongholds in central England. Each victory brought not just territory but also population. As the Anglo-Saxon commanders faced the challenge of integrating Danish settlers who had lived under Norse rule for decades, this integration required a delicate balance of firmness and conciliation. The Danish settlers could not simply be expelled. They were too numerous and too well established for such a solution to be practical. Instead, they had to be persuaded to accept Anglo-Saxon rule while retaining their property and, to some extent, their customs. This meant accepting Danish legal traditions where they did not conflict with Anglo-Saxon law, respecting Danish religious practices where they had been influenced by Christianity, and incorporating Danish military leaders into the Anglo-Saxon command structure. Athelstan observed all of this as he grew to manhood in his aunt's household. By the late 910s, he was old enough to command troops in his own right, leading detachments of cavalry in the final campaigns that would complete the reconquest of Danish land. These experiences taught him invaluable lessons about the practical realities of ruling a diverse population and the importance of policies that could transform former enemies into loyal subjects. As the decade of the 910s drew to a close, had evolved from the small boy who had received his grandfather's gifts into a mature warrior and administrator in his own right. Contemporary sources, fragmentary though they are, suggest that he had become his father's most trusted lieutenant, the prince upon whom Edward increasingly relied for the governance of the expanded territories that their family's military successes had brought under West Saxon control. When Thelfald died suddenly in 918, the political landscape of England shifted dramatically. For nearly a decade, she had ruled Mercia as an independent sovereign, acknowledging Edward's overlordship, but maintaining her own court, issuing her own charters, and conducting her own military campaigns. Her death created a vacuum that Edward moved quickly to fill, deposing her daughter Gelfwin and incorporating Mercia directly into his own domains. This annexation of Mercia represented a crucial step toward the unification of England, but it also created new challenges for the royal family. The Mercians had grown accustomed to being ruled by one of their own, and many resented being reduced to the status of a province within a greater Wessex. Edward needed someone who could represent his interests in Mercia while maintaining the loyalty of the local nobility, and increasingly he turned to Athelstan for this delicate task. The surviving evidence suggests that during the final years of Edward's reign, Athelstan effectively served as his father's viceroy in Mercia. A charter from 924, issued just before Edward's death, lists Athelstan among the witnesses with the title Filius Regis, son of the king, and places him at the head of the list of royal family members. This prominent positioning suggests that he had become Edward's designated heir, despite the existence of other sons who might have competitive claims. But even as Athelstan's position within the royal family solidified, the broader political situation remained precarious. The reconquest of Danish Mercia and East Anglia had been a magnificent achievement, but one major prize remained beyond Anglo-Saxon reach: the Kingdom of Northumbria. and its capital at York. York was far more than just another city. It was the ancient capital of the north, the place where Roman emperors had held court, and where Anglo-Saxon kings had once ruled. Territories stretching from the Humber to the Scottish border. Since its capture by the Vikings in 866, York had become the centre of a Norse kingdom that maintained close connections with Dublin, the Isle of Man, and the other Viking settlements scattered across the Irish Sea. The current ruler of this northern kingdom was Sitric, a Viking king who had previously held the throne of Dublin, before crossing to England to claim his inheritance in York. Sitric was no mere local warlord, but a figure of international significance, a king whose alliances and enmities could influence the balance of power across the entire British Isles. Edward understood that the conquest of Northumbria would be the capstone of his career, the achievement that would make him the first king to rule all of England since the Roman withdrawal for centuries earlier. But he also understood that such a conquest would require careful preparation and perhaps a measure of good fortune. Northumbria was far from his power base in Wessex, surrounded by potentially hostile neighbours in Scotland and Wales, and defended by warriors who had never known defeat at Anglo-Saxon hands. As Edward contemplated the challenge of Northumbria, he could take comfort in knowing that he had raised a son capable of carrying on his work should fate intervene to cut short his own career. Athelstan had proven himself as both warrior and administrator, had earned the respect of the Mercian nobility, and had demonstrated the combination of firmness and diplomacy that would be essential for ruling the diverse populations of a unified England. But even the most careful plans can be disrupted by the unexpected interventions of death. And in July 924, death came suddenly to Edward the Elder as he campaigned in the very Mercian territories that his victories had secured. The king who had done so much to extend West Saxon power passed away while fighting to maintain control over his expanded domains, leaving behind a kingdom larger and more powerful than any Anglo-Saxon realm had ever been, but also a succession that was far from certain. The morning of July 17th, 924, dawned like any other in the long military career of Edward the Elder, but it would prove to be his last. The king was campaigning in northern Mercia, dealing with some local disturbance that threatened the stability of his recently annexed territories, when death struck with the sudden finality that was the constant companion of medieval rulers. The exact circumstances of Edward's death remain mysterious. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, usually reliable in its basic facts, provides no details beyond the date and location. Later chroniclers would offer various explanations: accident, or perhaps a wound received in fighting, but none can be verified from contemporary sources. What matters for our story is not how Edward died, but what his death meant for the kingdom he had spent a quarter-century building, and for the son who stood ready to inherit his crown. News of the king's death would have travelled slowly through the kingdom, carried by royal messengers who rode the Roman roads that still connected the major centres of Anglo-Saxon England. In Winchester, the ancient capital of Wessex, the news would have been received with shock and uncertainty. In the newly conquered territories of eastern England, Danish nobles who had submitted to Edward's rule might have seen opportunity in the transition between kings. Most crucially, in Mercia, where Athelstan had served as his father's representative, the future of the kingdom would depend on how quickly and decisively the succession could be resolved. For Athelstan was not Edward's only son. The king had married multiple times and fathered numerous children, creating a complex web of potential claimants to his throne. Among these was Glefwyd, born to Edward's second wife, Glefwyd, a prince who some believed might have ranked ahead of Athelstan in the succession order. The question of succession in Anglo-Saxon England was never straightforward. Unlike later medieval kingdoms, where strict primogeniture determined inheritance. The Anglo-Saxons followed a more flexible system that considered factors beyond simple birth order. Legitimacy of birth mattered, but so did military ability, political support, and the ability to defend the kingdom against its enemies. A weak king, however legitimate his claim, might find himself displaced by a stronger rival who could offer more effective leadership. In the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, it appears that different parts of the kingdom chose different successors. The Mercians, who had grown to respect Athelstan during his years among them, immediately proclaimed him as their king. His presence in Mercia when news of Edward's death arrived gave him a crucial advantage, allowing him to secure the loyalty of the local nobility before potential rivals could organize opposition. But in Wessex itself, the situation was more complicated. According to some sources, the West Saxons initially chose Gelfeard as their king, perhaps reflecting lingering doubts about Athelstan's legitimacy or simple loyalty to a prince who had been raised among them rather than in distant Mercia. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that Edward's carefully united kingdom might fragment once again, with Athelstan ruling Mercia as his aunt had done, while Gelfweard controlled the West Saxon heartland. Fate, however, intervened with dramatic suddenness. Just 16 days after his father's death, Gelfweard himself passed away under circumstances every bit as mysterious as those that had claimed Edward. The young prince died at Oxford, far from the main centres of West Saxon power, and the sources provide no explanation for his sudden demise. Gelfweard's death eliminated the most serious challenge to Athelstan's succession, but it did not immediately resolve all questions about the future of the kingdom. Other sons of Edward remained alive, and the very suddenness of both deaths within such a short time frame may have aroused suspicions among some nobles. Medieval politics was a dangerous game where convenient deaths often masked inconvenient murders, and ambitious princes had been known to remove rivals through poison, accident, or carefully staged hunting mishaps. Whether Gelfweard's death was natural or helped along by human intervention, it cleared the path for Athelstan to claim the entire inheritance of Edward the Elder. But even with his main rival eliminated, the new king faced significant challenges. In establishing his authority over the full extent of his father's domains, opposition to Athelstan's rule appeared to be particularly strong in Winchester, the ancient capital where Gelfweard had been popular and where many nobles remained suspicious of a king who had spent his formative years in Mercia rather than among his own West Saxon people. The Bishop of Winchester, one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in the kingdom, pointedly refused to attend Athelstan's eventual coronation and withheld his support for the new king for several years. Even more dramatically, a nobleman named Alfred, whose relationship to the royal family, if any, remains unknown, apparently organized a conspiracy to remove Athelstan from the throne through the expedient of blinding him. In medieval political culture, physical mutilation was often seen as a way to remove rivals without incurring the spiritual consequences of murder. A blind king could not rule effectively, but his assailants avoided the sin of regicide. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out, but its existence revealed the dangerous undercurrents that surrounded Athelstan's early reign. The new king understood that he could not simply assume that his father's subjects would automatically transfer their loyalty to him. He would need to prove himself worthy of the crown through his own actions, demonstrating the military skill, political wisdom, and personal charisma that could bind together the diverse populations of his inheritance. For more than a year after his father's death, Athelstan ruled as an uncrowned king, wielding royal authority but lacking the sacred legitimacy that could only come through proper coronation by the Archbishop of Canterbury. This delay was unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon history and reflects the magnitude of the opposition he faced, particularly in Wessex itself. During these months of uncertainty, Athelstan demonstrated the patience and political skill that would characterize his entire reign. Rather than trying to force acceptance through military action, he chose to win over his subjects through a combination of careful diplomacy, generous patronage, and strategic concessions that addressed the concerns of different regional and political factions. In Mercia, where his support was strongest, Athelstan behaved almost as an independent king, issuing charters witnessed only by Mercian bishops and nobles. This behavior may have reflected a temporary agreement with his West Saxon opponents, possibly including a promise that he would not marry or produce heirs who might threaten the claims of his half-brother's descendants. Some historians have suggested that Athelstan's decision to remain celibate throughout his life originated from these early political negotiations. By vowing never to marry or father children, he could reassure nobles who supported other branches of the royal family that his reign would be temporary, ending with his death and allowing the crown to pass to more acceptable candidates. Other scholars argue that his celibacy reflected genuine religious conviction, part of the spiritual reformation that was sweeping through the Anglo-Saxon church in the early 10th century. Whatever the explanation for his unmarried state, a patient approach to his succession crisis gradually began to bear fruit. One by one, the great nobles of Wessex made their peace with the new king, recognizing that he offered the best hope for maintaining the unity and strength that Edward the Elder had built through decades of careful conquest and diplomacy. The process was aided by Athelstan's own personal qualities, which became apparent to those who worked with him during this difficult period. Unlike some medieval kings who relied on fear and intimidation to maintain their authority, Athelstan combined genuine intellectual ability with political sophistication and personal charisma. He could discuss theology with bishops, military strategy with his generals, and legal precedents with his advisors, demonstrating the kind of well-rounded competence that inspired confidence in subordinates. By the late summer of 925, more than a year after his father's death, Athelstan finally felt secure enough to undergo the ceremony that would publicly confirm his royal status. The coronation was scheduled for September 4th at Kingston upon Thames, a location chosen for its rich symbolic significance. Kingston lay on the border between Wessex and Mercia, representing the unity that Athelstan hoped to maintain between the two kingdoms. The town had been the site of several previous royal ceremonies, giving it an aura of legitimacy that could help overcome doubts about the new king's status. Most importantly, Kingston was accessible to nobles from both sides of the ancient boundary, allowing representatives from across Athelstan's domains to witness his elevation to sacred kingship. The ceremony itself marked a significant departure from previous Anglo-Saxon coronations. Earlier kings had been crowned wearing helmets in the traditional Germanic fashion, emphasizing their role as war leaders and protectors of their people. But Athelstan chose to don an actual crown, following the Carolingian and Byzantine customs that emphasized the sacred nature of kingship and the divine source of royal authority. This innovation was probably the work of Archbishop Athelm of Canterbury, who performed the coronation ceremony and may have designed the new liturgy that accompanied it. The archbishop understood that Athelstan's contested succession required all possible reinforcement of his legitimacy, and the adoption of more elaborate ceremonial borrowed from the great empires of continental Europe helped to elevate the new king above the level of a mere tribal war leader. As the crown was placed upon his head and the assembled nobles raised their voices in acclamation, Athelstan could reflect upon the long and difficult journey that had brought him to this moment of triumph. From the mysterious circumstances of his birth, through the years of education and military service to the political struggles following his father's death, every experience had prepared him for the challenges that lay ahead, and those challenges were immense, though he now ruled the largest Anglo-Saxon kingdom in history, stretching from the English Channel in the south to the Humber River in the north. Athelstan's authority remained limited and contested. Danish York stood defiantly independent beyond his northern borders, its king maintaining close connections with Norse Dublin and posing a constant threat to the stability of northern England. Welsh kingdoms preserved their independence beyond the ancient earthwork of Ufasdyke, their rulers watching for any sign of weakness that might allow them to reclaim territories lost to Anglo-Saxon expansion. Scottish kings looked southward with suspicion and occasional hostility, viewing the growth of West Saxon power as a direct threat to their own security. Even within his own domains, questions of legitimacy and regional loyalty continued to simmer. Beneath the surface of apparent unity, the Mercians might accept his rule, but they retained their own cultural identity and political traditions that could reassert themselves if his authority wavered. The recently conquered Danish territories of the east remained potentially unstable, their populations divided between those who had accepted Anglo-Saxon rule and those who still looked northward to York or across the sea to Scandinavia for leadership. In the months following his coronation, Athelstan began to implement the policies that would define his reign and transform England from a collection of recently conquered territories into something approaching a unified nation. His approach combined the military traditions inherited from his grandfather and father with innovations that reflected his own experiences and the unique challenges of ruling such a diverse kingdom. One of his first priorities was the consolidation of the administrative systems that governed his expanded realm. The rapid conquest of Danish territories during the previous decade had created a patchwork of legal and governmental arrangements that needed to be rationalized and standardized if the kingdom was to function effectively. In some areas, Anglo-Saxon law and custom prevailed, while in others, Danish legal traditions continued to operate alongside or instead of West Saxon precedents, rather than attempting to impose uniform systems everywhere immediately. Chose a more gradual approach that respected local customs while slowly extending royal authority into all aspects of governance. New royal officials were appointed to oversee the collection of taxes and the administration of justice, but these appointments were often drawn from local populations and worked within existing frameworks rather than replacing them entirely. This policy of gradual integration extended to the military organization of the kingdom as well. The Anglo-Saxon fyrd system, by which all free men owed military service to their king, was expanded to include the Danish territories, but local military customs and leadership structures were largely preserved. Danish jarls who had submitted to Athelstan's rule found themselves incorporated into the Anglo-Saxon hierarchy as aldermen, responsible for maintaining order and defending their regions against external threats. The success of these policies depended heavily on Athelstan's ability to inspire personal loyalty. Among nobles who had little historical connection to the West Saxon royal house, unlike his predecessors, who had ruled primarily over people who shared their cultural background and political traditions, Athelstan governed a kingdom that included substantial populations of Danish settlers, Welsh collaborators, and Mercian nobles whose loyalty to Wessex remained conditional to build the personal relationships that medieval kingship required. Athelstan spent much of his early reign traveling throughout his domains, holding court in different regions, and meeting face-to-face with the local leaders whose support he needed. These royal progresses served multiple purposes. They allowed the king to show himself to his subjects, demonstrating his authority and accessibility. They provided opportunities for local nobles to present their grievances and requests directly to the crown, and they enabled Athelstan to assess the loyalty and competence of his regional representatives. During these travels, Athelstan also began to develop the reputation for piety and learning that would become one of his defining characteristics. Unlike many medieval warriors, who viewed scholarship with suspicion or indifference, Athelstan genuinely enjoyed intellectual pursuits and used his royal resources to patronize scholars and collect books and relics from across Europe. His court began to attract learned men from many different backgrounds, monks fleeing Viking raids on their monasteries, Frankish scholars seeking patronage in a more stable political environment, and even occasional visitors from as far away as Byzantium and Rome. These scholars brought with them not just knowledge but also connections to the wider intellectual world of medieval Europe, helping to establish Athelstan's court as a center of learning that could rival the greatest Carolingian and Byzantine institutions. The king's personal interest in scholarship extended beyond mere patronage to active participation in intellectual discussions and even, according to some sources, original composition. Several poems celebrating his victories and achievements survive from this period, and while their authorship remains disputed, some historians believe that Athelstan himself may have contributed to their creation. Perhaps most remarkably, began to develop what would become an obsession with collecting religious relics. Medieval Christians believed that the physical remains of saints and martyrs possessed miraculous powers that could heal the sick, protect against evil, and bring divine favor to those who venerated them properly. For a king whose legitimacy remained somewhat questionable, possession of particularly powerful relics could provide spiritual validation that complemented political authority. Athelstan's agents began traveling across Europe in search of relics that could be acquired for the royal collection. Some came as diplomatic gifts from foreign rulers eager to establish friendly relations with the increasingly powerful English king. Others were purchased at considerable expense from monasteries and churches that needed funds for reconstruction or expansion. Still others may have been acquired through less legitimate means, though the sources are discreetly silent about such possibilities. Among the most famous items in Athelstan's collection were artifacts of questionable but impressive provenance. Fragments claimed to be from the true cross on which Christ was crucified, pieces of the crown of thorns placed on Jesus' head during his passion, and even weapons supposedly used by biblical and historical figures. The Holy Lance, said to be the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, became one of the most prized possessions in the royal treasury. Modern historians are naturally skeptical about the authenticity of such relics, noting that medieval Europe was awash with fraudulent artifacts, and that multiple institutions often claimed to possess the same unique items. But authenticity mattered less than belief in medieval political culture, and Athelstan's reputation as a collector of powerful relics enhanced his prestige among both his own subjects and foreign observers. As Athelstan consolidated his authority over the southern and central regions of his kingdom, his attention inevitably turned northward toward the last major challenge to English unification, the independent Kingdom of York and its Danish ruler. Sitrick Siege York was far more than just another city that had fallen under foreign rule. It was the ancient capital of the north, the place where Roman emperors had maintained their British headquarters, and where Anglo-Saxon kings had once ruled territories stretching from the Humber to the Scottish border. Its capture by the Vikings in 866 had ended forever the independence of Northumbria, one of the greatest of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and established Norse rule over a region that included not just the city itself, but much of what would become Yorkshire and Lancashire. The current ruler of this northern kingdom, Sitrick Siege, was no ordinary Viking raider, but a king of international significance whose alliances and enmities influenced the balance of power across the entire British Isles. Before claiming York, he had been king of Dublin, the greatest Norse city in Ireland, and the centre of a trading network that extended from Iceland to Byzantium. His family connections reached across the Viking world, linking him to rulers in Norway, the Hebrides, the Isle of Man, and the scattered Norse settlements that dotted the coasts of Ireland and Scotland. Sitric's position in York made him the natural leader of those forces that opposed Athelstan's unification of England. Danish settlers throughout northern England looked to him for leadership and protection against Anglo-Saxon expansion. Scottish kings, worried about the growth of southern power, saw him as a potential ally in any future conflict with Athelstan. Even some Welsh rulers, despite their geographical distance from York, understood that Sitric's independence helped to check the ambitions of a West Saxon monarchy that might otherwise turn its attention westward toward their own territories. 4. The conquest of York represented both the completion of his family's century-long project of English unification and a personal test of his ability to succeed where his predecessors had failed. His grandfather Alfred had never seriously attempted to extend West Saxon rule beyond the boundaries established by his treaty with Guthrum. His father Edward had concentrated on reconquering the Danish territories of central England, achieving remarkable success but stopping short of challenging York's independence. If Athelstan could succeed in conquering York, he would become the first Anglo-Saxon king to rule all of England since the Viking invasions began in the 9th century. Such an achievement would establish his legitimacy beyond question and provide the foundation for the even greater ambitions that were beginning to form in his mind, the creation of an imperial realm that might extend beyond England to encompass Wales, Scotland, and perhaps even territories across the Irish Sea. But the conquest of York could not be achieved through military force alone. The city was too far from Athelstan's power base in the south, too well defended by its Danish garrison, and too strongly supported by potential allies across the Irish Sea and beyond the Scottish border. Any attempt at direct military conquest would require a massive commitment of resources and would leave Athelstan's southern territories vulnerable to attack by other enemies. Instead, the young king chose to pursue a diplomatic strategy that reflected both his understanding of Viking culture and his growing sophistication in the arts of international politics. Rather than threatening Sitric with invasion, Athelstan proposed a marriage alliance that would bind the two kingdoms together through bonds of kinship and mutual interest. The negotiations for this extraordinary alliance required delicate handling of religious, cultural, and political sensitivities that could easily have derailed the entire project. Sitric, though he had nominally converted to Christianity, ruled over a population that included many recent pagan immigrants from Ireland and Scandinavia. His court retained many of the customs and traditions of pre-Christian Viking culture, including practices like polygamy and slavery that horrified Christian observers. Athelstan, by contrast, had to satisfy a Christian nobility that viewed marriage alliances with former heathens as potentially compromising to their own spiritual status. The Archbishop of Canterbury and other senior churchmen needed to be convinced that such an alliance served legitimate political purposes without endangering the souls of those involved. Regional nobles, particularly in Wessex, where opposition to Athelstan's rule had been strongest, might interpret any sign of weakness or accommodation with Vikings as evidence that their king lacked the determination necessary to protect Christian England. Despite these challenges, both rulers understood that marriage offered a path to peace that military conquest could not guarantee. For Sitric, an alliance with Athelstan provided protection against potential rivals within the Viking world and recognition of his legitimacy as King of York. For Athelstan, marriage diplomacy offered the possibility of achieving his goals without the enormous costs and risks that would attend a military campaign in the distant north. The woman chosen to seal this alliance was one of Athelstan's sisters, whose name has unfortunately not survived in any contemporary source. This anonymity reflects the broader pattern of medieval record-keeping, which often ignored women unless they achieved unusual prominence through their own actions. But the unnamed princess who travelled north to become Queen of York played a crucial role in one of the most important diplomatic initiatives of the early 10th century. As our first part of this peaceful journey draws to a close, we leave Athelstan in these crucial early years of his reign, having secured his contested throne and begun to contemplate the great challenges that lay ahead. The marriage alliance with York represented both the pinnacle of his diplomatic achievements thus far, and the foundation for even greater ambitions that would define the remainder of his remarkable career. The winter of 925 to 926 found England blanketed in an unusual peace, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for the momentous events that would unfold with the coming spring. Athelstan, now secure upon his throne after the struggles of his accession, had spent the months following his coronation in careful preparation for the diplomatic masterstroke that would define his reign and change the course of English history. The proposal he had sent northward to York was audacious in its simplicity. Let the ancient enmity between Anglo-Saxon and Dane be healed through the sacred bonds of marriage. Let his unnamed sister become Queen of York, binding the two kingdoms together through kinship and mutual interest. Let the last great Viking stronghold in England be incorporated into his realm, not through conquest, but through the more subtle arts of diplomacy and alliance. King Sitric's response, when it finally arrived at Athelstan's court, reflected the complex calculations that governed Viking politics in the early 10th century. The Danish king was no simple warrior chieftain, but a sophisticated ruler who understood that his position in York depended as much on international support as on local military strength. His previous reign in Dublin had taught him the importance of maintaining relationships with multiple potential allies, balancing competing interests to preserve his independence against stronger neighbours. For Sitric, marriage to an Anglo-Saxon princess offered several compelling advantages. It would provide recognition of his legitimacy as King of York, elevating him from the status of a foreign conqueror to that of an accepted member of the British royal family. It would guarantee Athelstan's support against potential rivals within the Viking world, particularly the ambitious kings of Dublin who might seek to reclaim the throne that Sitric had once occupied. Most importantly, it would secure his southern border, allowing him to concentrate his military resources on defending against Scottish incursions or Irish Viking raids, rather than constantly watching for Anglo-Saxon invasion. But the alliance also carried significant risks for the Danish king. His own nobles, many of whom had never fully accepted Christian baptism despite their king's nominal conversion, might view marriage to a Christian princess as a betrayal of their ancestral traditions. His connections to the wider Viking world, so crucial for trade and military support, could be compromised if he appeared too closely aligned with Anglo-Saxon interests. Most dangerously, the alliance might prove to be merely the first step in a process that would eventually lead to the complete absorption of his kingdom into Athelstan's expanding realm. Despite these concerns, Sitric ultimately decided that the benefits of alliance outweighed the risks. Perhaps he calculated that his own political skills would enable him to maintain his independence while enjoying Anglo-Saxon protection. Perhaps he believed that the marriage would create genuine bonds of kinship that would restrain any future Anglo-Saxon aggression. Or perhaps he simply recognized that his military position was too weak to resist Athelstan indefinitely and chose to negotiate from a position of relative strength rather than wait for the inevitable invasion. The formal negotiations for the marriage alliance took place during the early weeks of 926, with representatives from both kingdoms meeting at carefully chosen neutral locations to work out the complex details that such arrangements required. These discussions went far beyond the simple exchange of bride and groom to encompass trading rights, territorial boundaries, mutual defense obligations, and the delicate questions of precedence and protocol that could make or break royal relationships. One of the most sensitive issues involved the religious status of the bride. As a Christian princess, Athelstan's sister could not be expected to participate in pagan rituals or tolerate polytheistic practices at her new court. Yet as queen of a kingdom with a substantial pagan population, she would need to avoid actions that might be interpreted as an attack on traditional Norse customs. The negotiators eventually agreed on a compromise that allowed the princess to maintain her Christian faith while respecting the religious diversity of her new subjects. Equally complex were the questions surrounding the future status of any children born from the marriage. Would they be considered Anglo-Saxon princes and princesses, eligible to inherit Athelstan's throne if his own line failed? Or would they be Danish royalty, destined to rule York as independent monarchs? The ambiguity that surrounded these questions may have been deliberate, allowing both sides to interpret the agreement in ways that served their own interests. When the negotiations were finally complete, the wedding ceremony itself took place, with all the pageantry that befitted such a momentous occasion. The location was probably Tamworth, the ancient capital of Mercia, chosen for its symbolic significance as a place where Anglo-Saxon and Danish cultures had long coexisted. The ceremony combined Christian and Viking elements in a way that honored both traditions while creating something entirely new. The bride herself remains a mysterious figure, her name unrecorded by the chroniclers who preserved the memory of these events for posterity. This anonymity reflects the broader patterns of medieval historical writing, which often ignored women unless they achieved unusual prominence through their own actions. Yet the unnamed princess who traveled north to become Queen of York played a crucial role in one of the most important diplomatic initiatives of the early 10th century. Contemporary observers seem to have recognized the extraordinary significance of the marriage. For the first time in decades, an Anglo-Saxon princess had married a Viking king, symbolically uniting the two peoples who had been locked in conflict since the great invasions of the 9th century. The wedding represented not just a political alliance but a cultural reconciliation that suggested new possibilities for the future of England. The marriage alliance between Athelstan and Sitrick created a brief period of unusual stability in northern England, as both kings worked to implement the agreements they had negotiated so carefully. Trade between the two kingdoms flourished as merchants took advantage of the improved security that the alliance provided. Cultural exchange followed in the wake of commercial contact, with Anglo-Saxon scholars visiting York to study the manuscripts preserved in its libraries, while Danish Scots found welcome at Athelstan's court. But even as the two kings labored to build a lasting partnership, the forces of mortality that governed all human affairs were preparing to intervene in ways that neither could have anticipated. Medieval life was precarious for kings as well as common people, constantly threatened by disease, accident, and the violence that attended political power. The elaborate plans and careful negotiations that had created the Anglo-Danish alliance could be shattered by a single unexpected death. That death came in early 927, barely a year after the wedding that had sealed the alliance between the two kingdoms. King Sitrick died suddenly at York, leaving behind a young widow, a kingdom in uncertainty, and a diplomatic situation that would test all of Athelstan's political skills. The exact cause of Sitrick's death remains unknown to this day. Contemporary sources provide no details beyond the basic fact of his passing, leaving later historians to speculate about whether he succumbed to illness, accident, or perhaps more sinister causes. Medieval political life was notoriously dangerous. and ambitious nobles had been known to remove inconvenient rulers through poison, assassination, or carefully staged accidents that eliminated rivals while preserving plausible deniability. Whatever the circumstances of Sitric's death, its timing could hardly have been more significant for the future of England. The Danish king died before his marriage to Athelstan's sister had produced any children, leaving no direct heir to inherit his throne. According to Viking custom, the crown should have passed to the nearest male relative, but Sitric's family relationships were complex and contested, creating opportunities for multiple claimants to advance their own ambitions. The most obvious candidate was Guthfrith, a kinsman of Sitric who had previously served as a minor king in Ireland, and who commanded significant support among the Norse populations of the Irish Sea region. Guthfrith's claim was strengthened by his military experience and his connections to the Dublin Vikings, who could provide naval support for any attempt to seize York. But his candidacy also faced serious obstacles, particularly the opposition of those Danish nobles in York who preferred local autonomy to rule by an Irish-based king. Other potential claimants included various sons and nephews of previous Viking kings, each with their own supporters and their own interpretations of the complex genealogies that determined succession in Norse culture. The multiplicity of candidates virtually guaranteed a period of instability and conflict that could have devastating consequences for the ordinary people of northern England. Athelstan understood immediately that Sitric's death had transformed the entire political landscape of Britain. The careful balance of power that the marriage alliance had created no longer existed, replaced by a fluid situation that offered both tremendous opportunities and significant dangers. If he acted quickly and decisively, he might be able to accomplish, through political maneuvering, what would have required years of military campaigning. But if he hesitated or miscalculated, he might find himself facing a united coalition of enemies that could threaten the very foundations of his kingdom. The key to success lay in the ambiguous nature of the marriage alliance itself. During the negotiations of the previous year, both sides had deliberately avoided precise definitions of what the alliance would mean for the future relationship between the two kingdoms. Now, with Sitric dead and no clear successor apparent, Athelstan could argue that the marriage had created a form of joint sovereignty that gave him legitimate claims to rule York directly. This interpretation was legally questionable and politically dangerous, but it provided the justification that Athelstan needed for the bold action he was contemplating. Rather than waiting for the succession crisis in York to resolve itself, he would intervene directly to claim the throne for himself, making himself the first Anglo-Saxon king to rule all of England since the Viking invasions began. The spring of 927 found Athelstan engaged in the most intensive military preparations of his career, as he assembled the forces that would carry out his audacious plan to conquer York and complete the unification of England. Unlike the carefully planned campaigns of his father and grandfather, which had evolved slowly over years of systematic advance, Athelstan's northern expedition required rapid movement and perfect timing to succeed. The king understood that his window of opportunity was narrow. News of Sitric's death was spreading throughout the Viking world, and rival claimants to the York throne would soon begin organizing their own expeditions to seize the prize. Guthfrith was already gathering support in Ireland, assembling a fleet that could transport a substantial army across the Irish Sea. Other potential rivals were mobilizing their own forces, creating a race against time that would determine the future of northern England. Athelstan's military preparations reflected the lessons he had learned during his apprenticeship in the reconquest of Danish Mercia. Rather than relying solely on the traditional Anglo-Saxon fyrd system, which could take weeks to mobilize, he built his army around a core of professional warriors who could move quickly and fight effectively regardless of season or weather. These household troops were supplemented by cavalry units drawn from the recently conquered Danish territories, men who understood Viking tactics and could serve as both scouts and shock troops. The logistical challenges of the campaign were immense. York lay more than 200 miles north of Athelstan's power base in central England, across terrain that included rivers, marshes, and hills that could slow or stop an advancing army. The roads, such as they were, had not been maintained since Roman times and might be impassable during the spring rains that were common in northern England. Most critically, the army would need to carry sufficient supplies to sustain itself during what might be a prolonged siege, since the countryside around York could not be relied upon to provide adequate provisions. Athelstan solved these problems through a combination of careful planning and diplomatic preparation. Advanced parties were sent ahead to establish supply depots at strategic locations along the route of march, while loyal nobles in the northern regions were instructed to gather provisions and prepare their own contingents for service. Most importantly, the king established secret communications with potential allies within York itself, Danish nobles who might be willing to support his claim in exchange for guarantees of their own positions and properties. The march northward began in late spring, as soon as the roads had dried sufficiently to support the movement of heavily laden wagons and the large horse herds that accompanied medieval armies. Athelstan's forces moved in multiple columns to avoid congestion and reduce their vulnerability to ambush, with each column following a slightly different route toward the common objective of York. The psychological impact of the army's approach may have been as important as its military strength. For decades, the people of northern England had grown accustomed to the independence of their Danish rulers, viewing themselves as separate from the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the south. Now they were confronted with the reality of southern military power, as Athelstan's banners appeared on the horizons of their familiar landscapes, and his troops occupied the strategic crossroads that controlled access to their homeland. Contemporary sources provide frustratingly few details about the actual conquest of York, suggesting that it may have been accomplished with surprising ease. The lack of any recorded battles or sieges implies that Athelstan's diplomatic preparations had been successful, that significant elements within the city were willing to accept his rule rather than face the uncertainties of a prolonged succession struggle. Guthfrith's attempted intervention came too late to prevent Athelstan's triumph. The Irish Viking king arrived off the Yorkshire coast with his fleet just as news reached him that York had already submitted to Anglo-Saxon rule. Faced with the choice between attempting a hopeless assault on a fortified city defended by a superior army or withdrawing to fight another day, Guthfrith chose the latter course and sailed back to Ireland to contemplate future opportunities. The speed and completeness of Athelstan's victory sent shockwaves throughout the British Isles. For the first time since the Viking invasions began in the 9th century, all of England, south of the Scottish border, was united under a single ruler. The last independent Danish kingdom had fallen not through years of grinding warfare, but through a brilliantly executed campaign that had lasted only a few months. The conquest of York made Athelstan the most powerful ruler in the British Isles, but it also created new challenges that would test his diplomatic skills as thoroughly as the campaign had tested his military abilities. The sudden expansion of Anglo-Saxon power northward had alarmed every neighboring kingdom, creating the potential for a hostile coalition that could reverse all of his gains. Scottish kings, in particular, viewed the appearance of Anglo-Saxon forces on their southern border with deep suspicion and concern. For centuries, the independence of York had served as a buffer between Scotland and the expanding power of southern England. Now that buffer was gone, replaced by direct Anglo-Saxon control over territories that had traditionally served Scottish interests. King Constantine II of Scotland was the most formidable of Athelstan's potential enemies, a ruler who had spent decades consolidating his authority over the diverse populations of his Highland kingdom and who commanded sufficient military resources to pose a serious threat to Athelstan's northern conquests. Constantine's kingdom extended from the Forth River in the south to the islands of the far north, encompassing not just the Scottish Highlands, but also substantial portions of what would later become the Lowlands. The Welsh kingdoms, though geographically distant from York, also had reasons to fear Athelstan's growing power. Their own independence depended partly on the existence of other centres of resistance to Anglo-Saxon expansion, and the fall of York suggested that no kingdom, however ancient or well defended, was immune to Athelstan's ambitions. The Welsh kings understood that they might be next on the list of territories marked for conquest, rather than waiting for these various enemies to organize their opposition. Athelstan chose to take the diplomatic initiative through a grand gesture that would demonstrate both his strength and his willingness to respect the legitimate interests of his neighbours. He proposed a great assembly at which all the major rulers of Britain would come together to negotiate a new framework for inter-kingdom relations. The location chosen for this historic gathering was Eamont Bridge, near Penrith in what is now Cumbria, a site that possessed both practical and symbolic significance. Geographically, Eamont lay roughly halfway between York and the Scottish border, making it accessible to representatives from all the major kingdoms while remaining clearly within Athelstan's sphere of influence. Symbolically, the site had ancient associations with royal assemblies and treaty negotiations, giving the proposed meeting an aura of legitimacy that drew on centuries of tradition. The invitations to the Eamont Assembly were carefully crafted to balance Athelstan's new position as overlord of England with recognition of his neighbours' continuing independence. The language used in these diplomatic communications was deliberately ambiguous, allowing each recipient to interpret the invitation in ways that preserved their own dignity while acknowledging the changed balance of power that Athelstan's victories had created. As the summer of 927 progressed, representatives began converging on Eamont from across the British Isles. King Constantine II came south from Scotland with a substantial retinue that demonstrated both his own royal dignity and his military strength. Welsh kings, including Hywel, Didier of Deheubarth, made the long journey from their western homelands, bringing with them advisors and warriors who could assess the new situation in northern England. Even Owain of Strathclyde, ruler of the British kingdom that controlled the area around modern Glasgow, accepted Athelstan's invitation despite his own complex relationships with both Scottish and English neighbours. The assembly itself, which took place on July 12, 927, represented one of the most important diplomatic gatherings in early medieval British history. For the first time since the Roman withdrawal 3 centuries earlier, representatives of all the major kingdoms of Britain had come together in a single location to negotiate their mutual relationships and establish principles for future cooperation. Athelstan's management of the assembly demonstrated the diplomatic skills that he had been developing since his youth. Rather than demanding immediate submission from his guests, he structured the negotiations as a series of bilateral discussions that allowed each kingdom to preserve its own interpretation of what was being agreed. The final ceremony, in which the assembled rulers formally acknowledged Athelstan's position, was crafted to satisfy his need for recognition, while avoiding language that might compromise his neighbours' independence. The specific terms agreed upon at Eamont have not survived in any contemporary document, but the broad outlines of the settlement can be reconstructed from later events and references. Constantine II of Scotland acknowledged Athelstan as overlord of all English territories, effectively recognizing the legitimacy of the conquest of York while securing guarantees that Athelstan would not attempt to extend his direct rule into Scottish territory. The Welsh kings accepted similar arrangements that acknowledged Athelstan's supremacy while preserving their own local autonomy. Perhaps most importantly, all parties agreed to a framework for resolving future disputes through negotiation rather than warfare. This commitment to diplomatic solutions represented a significant departure from the constant warfare that had characterized British politics for centuries, creating possibilities for sustained peace and cooperation that had not existed since Roman times. The success of the Eamont Assembly encouraged Athelstan to pursue even more ambitious diplomatic initiatives, particularly with regard to the Welsh kingdoms that had long maintained their independence beyond the ancient earthwork of Offa's Dyke. The conquest of York had demonstrated his military capabilities, while the Eamont negotiations had shown his willingness to work through diplomatic channels, rather than relying solely on force. Wales in the early 10th century presented a complex political landscape that reflected centuries of division and internal conflict. Unlike England, which had gradually consolidated into a handful of major kingdoms, Wales remained fragmented into numerous small realms, each with its own royal dynasty, its own territorial ambitions, and its own interpretation of what constituted legitimate authority. The largest and most powerful of these Welsh kingdoms was Deheubarth, ruled by Hywel Ddi Hywel, the Gooder king, whose reputation for wisdom and justice extended far beyond his own borders. Hywel's realm encompassed much of southwestern Wales, including the rich agricultural lands of Pembrokeshire and the strategic coastlines that controlled access to the Irish Sea. His court at Dynfa had become a centre of Welsh learning and culture, attracting poets and scholars from across the Celtic world. In the southeast, the Kingdom of Gwent maintained its independence under rulers who claimed descent from the ancient British kings who had resisted both Roman and Anglo-Saxon conquest. Gwent's position along the border with England had made it a frequent battleground, but it had also given its people valuable experience in the arts of diplomacy and survival that smaller kingdoms often lacked. The northern regions were dominated by Gwynedd, the mountain kingdom that had served as the last refuge of British independence during the Anglo-Saxon conquests of the early medieval period. From their strongholds in Snowdonia, the kings of Gwynedd had maintained a fierce tradition of resistance to foreign domination, viewing themselves as the true heirs of the legendary Arthur and the defenders of authentic British culture against foreign corruption. Smaller kingdoms dotted the Welsh landscapers in the central regions, Britanniae in the southeast, and numerous minor principalities that owed shifting allegiances to their more powerful neighbours. This political fragmentation had long been both a source of weakness and a form of protection for the Welsh people, making unified resistance difficult, but also preventing any single conqueror from gaining control over the entire region. Athelstan's approach to Welsh politics reflected both his understanding of this complex situation and his broader strategic goals for Britain as a whole. Rather than attempting to conquer Wales through direct military action, which would have been enormously expensive and might have united the various Welsh kingdoms against him, he chose to pursue a policy of gradual integration that respected Welsh autonomy while establishing clear Anglo-Saxon supremacy. The first step in this process was a second Great Assembly, held at Hereford in the autumn of 927, just a few months after the success at Eamont. Hereford was chosen for its symbolic significance as a border town that had long served as a meeting point between English and Welsh cultures. The city's location along the River Wye also provided practical advantages, making it accessible to Welsh kings while remaining clearly within Athelstan's own territory. The invitations to the Hereford Assembly were more explicit than those that had summoned the rulers to Eamont. Athelstan made it clear that he expected the Welsh kings to acknowledge his overlordship and to agree to specific obligations that would formalize their subordinate status. At the same time, he offered guarantees of their continued local autonomy and protection against external threats that might make submission more palatable. The response to these invitations revealed the divisions that existed within Welsh political society. Hywel Dda, the most powerful of the Welsh rulers, appears to have been among the first to accept Athelstan's terms, perhaps calculating that accommodation with Anglo-Saxon power offered better prospects for his kingdom's survival than futile resistance. His decision to submit influenced other Welsh kings, who recognized that isolated opposition would be suicidal once Deheubarth had aligned itself with Athelstan. Not all Welsh rulers came to Hereford willingly. However, some, apparently, required more direct forms of persuasion, though the sources are frustratingly vague about the precise methods that Athelstan employed. There are hints of military expeditions into Welsh territory during the summer of 927. Brief campaigns that may have been designed to demonstrate the consequences of refusal rather than to achieve permanent conquest. The assembly itself, when it finally convened, was structured as a formal ceremony of submission rather than the negotiated settlement that had characterized the Eamont gathering. One by one, the Welsh kings came forward to acknowledge Athelstan as their overlord, to promise annual tribute payments, and to agree to provide military service when required. In return, they received guarantees of protection and confirmation of their rights to rule their own territories under Anglo-Saxon supervision. The tribute payments demanded from the Welsh kingdoms were substantial, reflecting both Athelstan's need for revenue to support his expanded military commitments and his desire to demonstrate the practical benefits of his overlordship to his Anglo-Saxon subjects. According to later sources, the annual tribute included £20 of gold, £300 of silver, and 25,000 cattle resources that would significantly enhance the wealth and power of the English crown, perhaps more. Importantly, the Hereford Assembly established clear boundaries between English and Welsh territory, fixing the border along the River Wye in the region around Hereford itself. This demarcation provided security for both sides by reducing the ambiguities that had previously led to constant border skirmishing and cattle raiding. The submission of the Welsh kings also included an agreement to provide hostages as guarantees of their future loyalty. These hostages, typically younger sons or nephews of the ruling families, were brought to Athelstan's court, where they received education and training that would prepare them for future leadership, while ensuring their families' continued cooperation. The submissions at Eamont and Hereford marked a fundamental transformation in Athelstan's conception of his own role and responsibilities. No longer was he simply the king of an enlarged Wessex, or even the ruler of a unified England. He had become something unprecedented in post-Roman British history, an imperial monarch whose authority extended across multiple kingdoms and peoples. This new status was reflected in the titles that began to appear on Athelstan's coins and charters during the late 920s, where earlier documents had described him as King of the West Saxons or King of the Anglo-Saxons. New formulations proclaimed him Rex Anglorum, King of the English, or, even more grandly, Rex Totius, Britanniae, King of all Britain. These titles were not merely ceremonial flourishes, but represented genuine claims to universal authority that would have profound implications for the future development of British politics. By styling himself as ruler of all Britain, Athelstan was asserting rights that went far beyond traditional Anglo-Saxon concepts of kingship and drew, instead, on Roman and Carolingian models of imperial authority. The practical implementation of This imperial vision required new forms of governmental organization that could manage the complex relationships between the various kingdoms and peoples under Athelstan's overlordship. The existing Anglo-Saxon administrative system, however sophisticated it had become under Alfred and Edward, was designed for ruling a relatively homogeneous population within clearly defined territorial boundaries. Athelstan's solution was to expand and systematize the use of royal councils, the witons, that had long been a feature of Anglo-Saxon government, but which now took on new significance as instruments of imperial administration. These councils were enlarged to include not just Anglo-Saxon nobles, but also representatives from the Welsh kingdoms, Scottish borderlands, and recently conquered Danish territories. The frequency and scale of these assemblies was unprecedented in Anglo-Saxon history, where previous kings had typically held 1 or 2 major councils per year. Athelstan convened gatherings on an almost continuous basis, moving his court from region to region to ensure that all parts of his realm received direct royal attention. These royal progresses served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the king's authority to distant populations, provided opportunities for local grievances to be heard and resolved, and enabled the collection of the tribute and taxes that financed the entire system. Perhaps most remarkably, these councils were attended not just by Athelstan's own subjects, but by independent rulers who acknowledged his overlordship while maintaining their own territorial sovereignty. Welsh kings like Hywel Dda became regular participants in Anglo-Saxon governmental processes, witnessing charters and participating in discussions that affected the entire British Isles. This integration of formerly independent rulers into a common governmental framework was revolutionary in its implications. For the first time since the Roman Empire, Britain was beginning to develop shared political institutions that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. The precedents established during Athelstan's reign would influence British constitutional development for centuries to come. The king's imperial ambitions were also reflected in his approach to legal and administrative reform. Building on the foundations laid by his grandfather, Alfred, Athelstan initiated a comprehensive revision of Anglo-Saxon law that was designed to create uniform legal standards across his expanded realm. This project required careful balance between the desire for consistency and the need to respect local customs and traditions that had developed over centuries of independent evolution. The legal codes promulgated during Athelstan's reign addressed a wide range of issues that reflected the complexities of governing such a diverse kingdom. There were provisions for regulating trade between different regions, establishing standards for weights and measures, and ensuring that legal disputes could be resolved, regardless of the ethnic or cultural background of the parties involved. Particular attention was paid to the problem of theft and robbery, which had become endemic in many regions during the constant warfare of the previous century. Athelstan's laws prescribe harsh penalties for theft, including the death penalty for offenders over a certain age. But they also established procedures for ensuring that accusations were properly investigated and that innocent parties were protected from false charges. The implementation of these legal reforms required a significant expansion of royal administration, with new officials appointed to oversee the application of royal justice in distant regions. Many of these appointees were drawn from local populations, creating opportunities for advancement that helped to bind the various peoples of the realm to Athelstan's cause, while ensuring that royal policies were implemented by individuals who understood local conditions and customs. Even as Athelstan labored to create new forms of government for his imperial realm, he continued to pursue the scholarly interests that had characterized his court since the early years of his reign. Indeed, his growing power and prestige enabled him to attract an even more remarkable collection of intellectuals and artists, making his court one of the great centers of learning in 10th century Europe. The king's personal library, housed in the royal palace at Winchester, had grown to remarkable proportions through a combination of purchases, diplomatic gifts, and commissions of new works. Manuscripts arrived from across Europe, brought by scholars seeking royal patronage or sent by foreign rulers, eager to establish friendly relations with the increasingly powerful English king. Among the most prized items in this collection were illuminated gospels and biblical commentaries created in the scriptoriums of the great continental monasteries. These books were not merely textual repositories, but works of art in their own right, their pages adorned with miniature paintings and decorative initials that represented the highest achievements of medieval craftsmanship. Athelstan took particular pleasure in commissioning new works that reflected his own interests and the specific needs of his realm. Among these was a magnificent life of Saint Cuthbert, the 7th century Northumbrian saint whose cult had become increasingly important to Athelstan's efforts to legitimize his rule over the former Danish territories of northern England. The Cuthbert's manuscript was remarkable not just for its textual content, but for its illustrations, which included what may be the earliest surviving portrait of an English king. The image shows Athelstan himself presenting the completed book to Saint Cuthbert, a composition that served both artistic and political purposes by associating the king with one of the most revered figures in northern English Christianity. The production of such manuscripts required the collaboration of teams of scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders, whose skills represented the culmination of centuries of monastic learning. Athelstan's patronage of these craftsmen helped to preserve and develop traditions that might otherwise have been lost during the disruptions of the Viking Age, ensuring that the cultural achievements of earlier generations would be transmitted to posterity. But Athelstan's intellectual interests extended far beyond the mere collection of books. His court became a gathering place for scholars from across Europe, men who brought with them not just their own learning, but also connections to the wider intellectual networks that linked the monasteries and schools of medieval Christendom. Among the most notable of these figures was Israel, the grammarian, a polymath whose origins remain mysterious, but whose achievements were recognized throughout the scholarly world. Israel was fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, making him one of the few Western European scholars capable of engaging directly with the classical and biblical traditions that formed the foundation of medieval learning. Under Israel's influence, Athelstan's court became a center for the study of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the traditional liberal arts that constituted the core of medieval education. But the scholars gathered at Winchester also pursued more specialized studies, including astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy, subjects that required access to rare texts and sophisticated instruments. The intellectual ferment created by this gathering of scholars produced new works of poetry, theology, and historical writing that reflected both the international character of Athelstan's court and the specifically English concerns that shaped his reign. Several poems celebrating his military victories survive from this period, works that combine classical literary techniques with Germanic heroic traditions to create a distinctively Anglo-Saxon form of royal panegyric. Perhaps most remarkably, the court scholars also engaged in more practical forms of intellectual activity, developing new techniques for land surveying, agricultural management, and military engineering that contributed directly to the effective governance of Athelstan's realm. This combination of theoretical learning and practical application represented a synthesis of Roman, Germanic, and Celtic traditions that was uniquely suited to the challenges of 10th century Britain. But among all of Athelstan's scholarly and cultural interests, none captured the imagination of his contemporaries quite like his passion for collecting religious relics. This obsession, which would have seemed strange to modern sensibilities, reflected the central role that Christianity played in medieval political culture and the particular challenges that Athelstan faced in legitimizing his authority over such a diverse realm. Medieval Christians believed that the physical remains of saints and martyrs possessed miraculous powers that could heal the sick, protect against evil, and bring divine favor to those who venerated them properly. For a king whose rule extended over populations with different religious traditions and cultural backgrounds, possession of particularly powerful relics could provide spiritual validation that transcended ethnic and political boundaries. Collection began modestly with items acquired from English monasteries and churches, but it quickly expanded to include artifacts claimed to originate from the Holy Land, Rome, and other centers of Christian pilgrimage. His agents traveled across Europe in search of relics that could be acquired through purchase, diplomatic exchange, or sometimes more questionable means. The most famous items in the royal collection were those claimed to have direct connections to the life and death of Jesus Christ. The Holy Lance, said to be the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, became one of the most prized possessions in the royal treasury. Fragments, supposedly from the true cross, were mounted in ornate reliquaries that became focal points for royal chapel services. Other relics connected Athelstan's collection to the broader history of Christian martyrdom and sanctity. The arm of St. Bartholomew, acquired through diplomatic negotiations with a Roman monastery, was believed to possess particular powers of protection against enemies. Hair claimed to belong to St. Mary Magdalene was housed in a crystal reliquary that became one of the wonders of the Winchester treasury. The authentication of these relics posed obvious challenges in an age without scientific methods for verifying age or provenance. Medieval collectors relied instead on documentary evidence letters from monastery archives, papal bulls, and similar documents that traced the history of each item. The existence of multiple institutions claiming to possess the same unique relic was a constant source of controversy and competition. But authenticity mattered less than belief in medieval political culture, and Athelstan's reputation as a collector of powerful relics enhanced his prestige among both his own subjects and foreign observers. Pilgrims began traveling to Winchester specifically to venerate the royal collection, bringing with them not just spiritual devotion but also economic benefits that helped to fund the king's other activities. The diplomatic implications of relic collecting were equally important. Foreign rulers, particularly those seeking to establish friendly relations with the increasingly powerful English king, found that gifts of religious artifacts were often more welcome than conventional presents of gold or jewels. The exchange of relics thus became a form of international diplomacy that operated alongside more conventional political and military relationships. Athelstan's agents in this spiritual commerce included some of the most distinguished churchmen of his realm. Cenwalde, Bishop of Worcester, spent considerable time traveling through Germany and France, officially on ecclesiastical business, but actually serving as the king's principal agent for acquiring new items for the royal collection. His connections to the reformed monasteries of the continent provided access to treasures that might otherwise have been impossible to obtain. The king's reputation as a collector eventually became so well established that monasteries and churches across Europe began sending him gifts without being asked, hoping to gain royal favor or support for their own projects. The prior of St. Sampson in Brittany wrote a letter that William of Malmesbury later quoted, noting that we know you value relics more than earthly treasure, a comment that captures the international recognition of Athelstan's particular interests. Relic collecting was just one aspect of a broader pattern of international engagement that distinguished his reign from those of his predecessors and helped to establish England as a major player in European politics. For the first time since the conversion to Christianity, an English king was actively pursuing diplomatic relationships that extended far beyond the British Isles. This international orientation reflected both practical necessity and personal inclination. The conquest of York and the establishment of overlordship over Wales and Scotland had eliminated the most immediate external threats to English security, but they had also created new responsibilities and opportunities that required careful management of relationships with continental powers. The most important of these relationships was with the emerging Ottonian dynasty in East Francia, the Germanic kingdom that was beginning to assert its own claims to imperial authority in succession to the Carolingian Empire. Henry the Fowler, the first Ottonian king, was engaged in his own process of territorial consolidation and recognized in Athelstan a potential ally whose support might prove valuable in future conflicts. The basis for this Anglo-German alliance was a marriage arrangement that would become one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of Athelstan's reign. In 929, Henry sent an embassy to the English court seeking a bride for his son, Otto, who was destined to become one of the most powerful rulers in medieval European history as Otto I. Later Holy Roman Emperor, Athelstan's response to this proposal was both generous and strategically astute. Rather than sending a single princess, he dispatched two of his half-sisters to the German court, allowing Otto to choose the bride who most appealed to him, while demonstrating the wealth and sophistication of the English royal family. Choice fell upon Edith, a princess whose beauty and intelligence were reportedly matched by her political acumen and cultural refinement. The wedding, which took place with great ceremony at the German court, created bonds between the two royal families that would influence European politics for generations to come. But Edith was not the only member of Athelstan's family to contract a continental marriage. His half-sister, Edhild, was wed to Hugh the Great, Duke of the Franks, a nobleman who wielded enormous influence in the Western Frankish kingdom and who would play a crucial role in the succession struggles that dominated French politics during the 10th century. These marriage alliances served multiple purposes beyond their immediate diplomatic value. They demonstrated England's emergence as a major European power worthy of alliance with the greatest continental dynasties. They provided Athelstan with reliable sources of information about political developments across Europe. Most importantly, they created networks of kinship and obligation that could be activated in times of crisis or opportunity. The practical benefits of these relationships became apparent during the 930s, when Athelstan found himself drawn into the complex succession crisis that was tearing apart the Frankish kingdom. His half-sister Edgifu, who had previously been married to Charles the Simple, arrived at the English court with her young son Louis, seeking support for the boy's claims to the Frankish throne. Athelstan's decision to support Louis's cause represented a significant expansion of English involvement in continental politics. The young pretender was given refuge at the English court, where he received the education and training that would prepare him for eventual rule. When the opportunity arose in 936, Athelstan provided both financial and military support for Louis's successful campaign to reclaim his father's throne. This intervention in Frankish politics established England as a factor that continental rulers could no longer ignore. The island kingdom that had once seemed isolated from the mainstream of European political development was now capable of influencing the succession to one of the most important thrones in Christendom. As the 920s gave way to the 930s, attention increasingly turned from conquest and diplomacy to the more mundane, but equally important tasks of administration and governance. The creation of his imperial realm had been a remarkable achievement. but its preservation would require new forms of governmental organization that could manage the complex relationships between different kingdoms and peoples. The expansion and systematization of royal charter production represented one of the most significant innovations of Athelstan's reign. Previous Anglo-Saxon kings had issued charters on an irregular basis, primarily to record land grants or resolve specific disputes. But Athelstan transformed charter production into a systematic tool of government that enabled him to maintain detailed control over the administration of his vast realm. The key figure in this administrative revolution was the scribe known to modern historians as Athelstan, an anonymous royal clerk whose distinctive handwriting and formulaic language can be identified in hundreds of documents produced between 928 and 935. The work of Athelstan represents the first clear evidence for the existence of a royal writing office, a primitive civil service that could produce standardized documents according to established procedures. The charters produced by Athelstan were remarkable for their consistency and detail. Unlike earlier documents, which often provided only basic information about the transaction being recorded, these new charters included comprehensive witness lists that documented exactly who was present at each royal assembly, detailed dating clauses that established precise chronologies for royal activities, and elaborate legal formulas that ensured the validity of each grant or judgment. This systematic approach to record-keeping served multiple purposes. It enabled the royal administration to maintain accurate records of land ownership, tax obligations, and legal precedents across the entire realm. It provided a mechanism for ensuring that royal commands were transmitted accurately to distant provinces. Most importantly, it created a documentary foundation for the unified legal system that Athelstan was attempting to establish throughout his territories. The legal codes promulgated during Athelstan's reign built upon this documentary foundation to create the most comprehensive system of royal law that England had yet seen. These codes addressed issues ranging from theft and violence to trade regulation and administrative procedure, establishing common standards that could be applied, regardless of the ethnic or cultural background of the parties involved. The famous Greatly Code, issued around 930, exemplified Athelstan's approach to legal reform. This comprehensive statute addressed the problem of theft, which had become endemic during the constant warfare of the previous century, but it did so in a way that balanced the need for deterrence with concern for proportionate justice. The code prescribed severe penalties for theft, including the death penalty for anyone over 12 years old caught stealing goods worth more than 8 pence. But it also established procedures for ensuring that accusations were properly investigated, that innocent parties were protected from false charges, and that young offenders received opportunities for rehabilitation rather than automatic execution. The implementation of this legal system required a significant expansion of royal administration, with new officials appointed to oversee the application of royal justice in regions that had previously operated according to their own customs and traditions. Many of these appointees were drawn from local populations, creating opportunities for advancement that helped to bind the various peoples of the realm to Athelstan's cause. The systematic nature of these reforms can be seen in the careful attention paid to the practical details of governance. Standardized weights and measures were established to facilitate trade between different regions. Common procedures were developed for the collection of taxes and tribute. Uniform practices were instituted for the maintenance of roads, bridges, and fortifications that were essential for military security and economic prosperity. As our second part of this gentle journey through Athelstan's remarkable reign draws toward its close, we find the once contested prince transformed into something unprecedented in post-Roman British history. an imperial monarch whose authority extended from the English Channel to the Scottish Highlands, whose word was law in kingdoms that had maintained their independence for centuries, and whose court had become a centre of learning and culture that attracted scholars and artists from across Europe. Yet even as Athelstan enjoyed the fruits of his diplomatic and administrative triumphs, new challenges were gathering on the horizon. The very success of his imperial project had alarmed powerful enemies who would soon unite in a desperate attempt to destroy the English monarchy before it could grow even stronger. In our next peaceful episode, we will witness how this coalition of the desperate would test Athelstan's military skills as thoroughly as he had already proven his diplomatic abilities, leading to the greatest battle in Anglo-Saxon history and the supreme test of everything he had built. The years that followed the great triumph at Brunanburh marked a fundamental transformation in both Athelstan's reign and the character of his kingdom. The crushing defeat of the Scottish-Irish coalition had eliminated the last serious military threat to English unification, allowing the king to turn his attention from the urgent necessities of warfare to the more refined pursuits of scholarship, diplomacy, and the consolidation of the remarkable imperial system he had constructed through 2 decades of patient effort. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw a fundamental shift in the balance of power throughout the British Isles. Olaf Guthfrith's retreat to Dublin marked the end of serious Norse pretensions to mainland British territory, while Constantine II's defeat effectively ended Scottish independence for a generation. The Welsh kingdoms, having wisely remained neutral during the conflict, found themselves more firmly than ever under English overlordship. Their earlier submissions now validated by Athelstan's demonstrated military supremacy. Perhaps most significantly, the battle's outcome finally resolved the question of English unity that had dominated British politics since the first Viking invasions. For the first time since the Roman withdrawal for centuries earlier, a single ruler exercised undisputed authority over all of what would become England, commanding the loyalty of populations from Cornwall to Northumberland and from East Anglia to the Welsh borders. This unprecedented political unity enabled Athelstan to pursue cultural and intellectual projects that would have been impossible during the uncertain years of his early reign. The royal court at Winchester became a magnet for scholars, artists, and churchmen from across Europe, attracted by the king's reputation for learning and his generous patronage of intellectual pursuits. The transformation of Winchester into a major centre of European learning was one of Athelstan's most remarkable achievements, representing a dramatic departure from the warrior culture that had traditionally dominated Anglo-Saxon society, where previous kings had been judged primarily by their success in battle. Athelstan consciously sought to establish his reputation as a patron of the arts and sciences, understanding that lasting greatness required cultural as well as military achievements. The royal library that he assembled at Winchester became one of the largest and most comprehensive collections in 10th century Europe, containing manuscripts gathered from monasteries and scriptoriums across the Christian world. Byzantine texts rubbed shoulders with Irish illuminated gospels. Carolingian theological treatises shared shelf space with Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and classical works of philosophy and literature provided intellectual foundations for original scholarship by the international community of scholars who had gathered at Athelstan's court. The grandiose titles that Athelstan had begun using in the years before Brunanburh took on new significance and authority in the wake of his great victory. No longer could foreign observers dismiss his claims to imperial status as empty boasting. He had proven his ability to enforce his will throughout the British Isles and to defend his realm against any conceivable coalition of enemies. The most ambitious of these titles, Rex Totius, Britanniae, king of all Britain, represented a conscious attempt to revive the imperial pretensions that had disappeared from British politics with the withdrawal of the Roman legions. By styling himself as ruler of all Britain, Athelstan was asserting claims that went far beyond traditional Anglo-Saxon concepts of kingship and drew instead on Roman and Carolingian models of universal authority. These claims were not merely ceremonial but reflected genuine aspirations to create a unified British state that would rank among the great powers of medieval Europe. The practical implementation of this vision required new forms of governmental organization that could manage the complex relationships between the various kingdoms and peoples under Athelstan's overlordship. The evidence for this imperial administration can be seen most clearly in the remarkable series of royal charters that survive from the final decade of Athelstan's reign. These documents reveal a governmental system of unprecedented sophistication, capable of coordinating activities across vast distances and managing relationships between diverse populations with different legal traditions and cultural backgrounds. The witness lists attached to these charters provide a unique window into the workings of Athelstan's imperial court. Welsh kings like Hywel appear alongside Anglo-Saxon aldermen and Danish nobles, all participating in a common governmental framework that transcended traditional ethnic and cultural boundaries. Scottish rulers, when they appeared at all, were carefully positioned in the witness lists to emphasize their subordinate status, while preserving sufficient dignity to make their participation politically acceptable. Perhaps most remarkably, these assemblies seem to have functioned as genuine, deliberative bodies rather than mere ceremonial occasions. The business conducted at royal councils included not just the formal witnessing of land grants, but also discussions of legal reform, administrative policy, and even international relations that affected the entire British Isles. This integration of formerly independent rulers into a common governmental framework was revolutionary in its implications. For the first time since the Roman Empire, Britain was beginning to develop shared political institutions that transcended ethnic and cultural boundaries. The precedents established during Athelstan's reign would influence British constitutional development for centuries to come, laying the foundations for the parliamentary system that would eventually emerge as one of England's greatest contributions to world civilization, building upon the administrative foundations he had established during his earlier years. Athelstan devoted considerable energy during the post-Brunanburh period to the creation of a comprehensive legal system that could serve the needs of his diverse and far-flung territories. This project represented one of the most ambitious attempts at legal unification in early medieval Europe, requiring careful balance between the desire for consistency and the need to respect local customs and traditions. The king's approach to legal reform reflected both his intellectual sophistication and his practical understanding of the challenges involved in governing such a complex realm. Rather than attempting to impose uniform laws everywhere at once, he chose to establish common principles and procedures while allowing for regional variations that respected established customs and traditions. The most famous of Athelstan's legal codes, promulgated it greatly around 930, addressed the persistent problem of theft and robbery that had plagued English society throughout the period of Viking invasions and political fragmentation. The code prescribes severe penalties for thieves, including the death penalty for anyone over 15 years old caught stealing goods worth more than 12 pence. But it also established sophisticated procedures for ensuring that accusations were properly investigated and that innocent parties were protected from false charges. The Greatly Code also introduced innovations that reflected Athelstan's understanding of the social causes of crime, recognizing that theft often resulted from poverty and desperation. The code included provisions requiring wealthy landowners to provide charity for the poor and to free one enslaved person annually as an act of Christian mercy. These requirements represented an early attempt to address the root causes of social disorder rather than simply punishing its symptoms. Subsequent legal codes, issued at Exeter, Faversham, and Thunderfield, refined and expanded these basic principles, creating a comprehensive framework of royal law that addressed issues ranging from commercial regulation to family relationships. The sophistication of these codes reflected the influence of learned churchmen like Archbishop Wulfhelm of Canterbury, who brought continental legal traditions to bear on distinctively English problems. Perhaps most importantly, Athelstan's legal reforms established the principle that royal law took precedence over local custom when the two came into conflict. This assertion of legal supremacy was crucial for the creation of a unified state, ensuring that disputes could be resolved according to common standards, regardless of the ethnic or cultural background of the parties involved. The practical implementation of these legal reforms required a significant expansion of royal administration, with new officials appointed to oversee the application of royal justice in regions that had previously operated according to their own customs and traditions. The success of this system can be measured by the fact that it survived Athelstan's death and provided the foundation for the sophisticated legal system that would characterize later Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. Among all of Athelstan's achievements during the peaceful years following Brunanburh, none captured the imagination of his contemporaries quite like his extraordinary passion for collecting religious relics. This obsession, which might seem strange to modern sensibilities, reflected the central role that Christianity played in medieval political culture and the particular challenges that Athelstan faced in legitimizing his authority over such a diverse realm. The king's collection, housed in specially constructed treasuries at Winchester and other royal centers, became legendary throughout medieval Europe for both its size and the remarkable provenance of its contents. Agents working on Athelstan's behalf traveled from Ireland to Byzantium, from Rome to the monasteries of Germany, seeking artifacts that could enhance the spiritual prestige of the English crown. The most famous items in the royal collection were those claimed to have direct connections to the life and death of Jesus Christ. The Holy Lance, said to be the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, became the centerpiece of the Winchester treasury. According to the accounts that have survived, this artifact was presented to Athelstan by Hugh the Great of France, as part of the diplomatic negotiations that led to the marriage of the English king's sister to the Frankish duke. Fragments, supposedly, from the true cross were mounted in ornate reliquaries crafted by the finest goldsmiths in England and continental Europe. These precious objects were not merely devotional aids, but powerful political symbols that demonstrated Athelstan's connections to the sacred history of Christianity and his worthiness to rule over a Christian people. The collection also included relics associated with the broader history of Christian martyrdom and sanctity. The arm of St. Bartholomew, acquired through diplomatic negotiations with Roman ecclesiastical authorities, was believed to possess particular powers of protection against enemies. Hair claimed to belong to St. Mary Magdalene was housed in a crystal reliquary that became one of the wonders of the Winchester treasury, attracting pilgrims from across Europe who came to venerate these sacred remains. Perhaps most importantly for Athelstan's political purposes, the collection included numerous relics associated with specifically English saints whose cults helped to legitimize his rule over the former Danish territories of northern England. His devotion to St. Cuthbert, the 7th century Northumbrian saint, was particularly pronounced, reflecting his understanding that religious legitimacy was as important as military conquest in securing the loyalty of his northern subjects. The magnificent manuscript of Bede's Life of St. Cuthbert that Athelstan commissioned for presentation to the saint's shrine at Chester Street represents one of the masterpieces of Anglo-Saxon book production. The volume includes what may be the earliest surviving portrait of an English king, showing Athelstan himself presenting the completed work to St. Cuthbert, in a composition that served both artistic and political purposes. The authentication and acquisition of these relics required a sophisticated network of diplomatic and commercial relationships that extended across medieval Europe. Bishops and abbots served as Athelstan's agents in this spiritual marketplace, using their ecclesiastical connections to identify potential acquisitions and negotiate the complex transactions that brought these treasures to England. Cenwalh, Bishop of Worcester, emerges from the surviving sources as one of the most important figures in this network, spending considerable time traveling through Germany and France on missions that combined ecclesiastical business with relic hunting. His connections to the reformed monasteries of the continent provided access to treasures that might otherwise have been impossible to obtain, while his diplomatic skills ensured that these acquisitions enhanced rather than damaged England's relationships with foreign powers. The victory at Brunanburh not only secured Athelstan's position within the British Isles, but also elevated England to unprecedented prominence in European political affairs. Foreign rulers who had previously viewed the island kingdom as a peripheral concern now recognized it as a major power whose friendship could be valuable and whose enmity could be dangerous. This transformation in England's international status created new opportunities for diplomatic engagement that Athelstan exploited with characteristic skill and sophistication. The marriage alliances that he had negotiated during his earlier years now bore fruit as the royal houses of France and Germany found themselves dealing with a Britanniae whose military prowess and political acumen commanded respect throughout the Christian world. The most significant of these relationships was with the emerging Ottonian dynasty in East Francia, where Athelstan's sister, Egith, had become queen through her marriage to Otto, the future Holy Roman Emperor. This connection provided England with a reliable ally in the complex political struggles that were reshaping continental Europe, while also giving Athelstan access to the intellectual and cultural resources of the German Church. The practical benefits of this alliance became apparent during the succession crisis that convulsed the Western Frankish kingdom throughout the 930s. Louis IV, Athelstan's nephew through his half-sister, Idgifu's marriage to Charles the Simple, had spent much of his youth at the English court before reclaiming his father's throne in 936. This personal connection created obligations of mutual support that drew England directly into continental political affairs for the first time since the Carolingian period. Athelstan's support for Louis's cause included not just diplomatic recognition, but also practical military assistance, including the provision of ships and troops for campaigns against rebellious French nobles. This intervention demonstrated England's emergence as a power capable of influencing events far beyond its own borders, marking a dramatic departure from the isolation that had characterized the island kingdom during the Viking Age. The king's reputation as a patron of learning and culture also attracted international attention, with scholars and artists from across Europe seeking employment at his court. The intellectual ferment created by this gathering of talent produced works of poetry, theology, and historical writing that enhanced England's cultural prestige, while contributing to the broader development of medieval European learning. Perhaps most remarkably, Athelstan's court became a place of refuge for royal exiles and displaced persons from across the continent. Alan II of Brittany received English support in his successful campaign to reclaim his duchy from Viking conquerors, while various German and French nobles found sanctuary at Winchester when political circumstances in their homelands became unfavorable. This policy of providing assistance to legitimate rulers who had been displaced by usurpers or foreign conquerors served multiple diplomatic purposes. It demonstrated Athelstan's commitment to the principle of legitimate monarchy, potentially deterring challenges to his own authority. It created networks of obligation and gratitude that could be activated when English interests required support. Most importantly, it established England as a defender of Christian civilization against pagan barbarism, a role that enhanced the kingdom's prestige throughout medieval Europe. The intellectual achievements of Athelstan's court during the final decade of his reign represented a renaissance of learning that would have profound consequences for the future development of English culture. The international community of scholars that gathered at Winchester created a synthesis of classical, patristic, and contemporary learning that established new standards for intellectual achievement throughout Northern Europe. The king's personal involvement in these scholarly activities went far beyond mere patronage to include active participation in the intellectual life of his court. Contemporary sources suggest that he was not only literate in Latin, but also capable of engaging in sophisticated theological and philosophical discussions with the learned men who served him. This intellectual engagement reflected the influence of his early education under Alfred the Great's scholars, as well as his own natural curiosity and intelligence. The library that Athelstan assembled at Winchester became one of the most comprehensive collections of its time, containing works that ranged from classical philosophy and literature to contemporary theology and historical writing. The king's agents systematically acquired manuscripts from monasteries and scriptoriums across Europe, creating a repository of learning that attracted scholars from distant lands and facilitated intellectual exchange on an unprecedented scale. Among the most notable figures associated with Athelstan's court was Israel the grammarian, a polymath whose mastery of Greek as well as Latin made him one of the most learned men of his generation. Under Israel's influence, the Winchester Scriptorium produced works that combined classical literary techniques with Christian theological insights, creating a distinctive style of learned writing that would influence English scholarship for centuries to come. The court also became a center for the production of illuminated manuscripts that ranked among the masterpieces of medieval art. The combination of English artistic traditions with continental techniques and materials created works of extraordinary beauty and sophistication that demonstrated the cultural achievements of Athelstan's reign to contemporary and future observers. Perhaps most importantly, the scholarly activities at Athelstan's court laid the intellectual foundations for the Benedictine reform movement that would transform English monasticism during the reigns of his successors. Figures like Dunstan and Thelwold, who would become the leading reformers of the later 10th century, received their early training in the intellectual environment that Athelstan had created, ensuring that his cultural legacy would outlive his political achievements. The influence of this intellectual renaissance extended far beyond the borders of England, as scholars trained at Athelstan's court carried their learning to other parts of Europe. The distinctive style of hermeneutic Latin that developed at Winchester became influential in continental monasteries, while English artistic techniques influenced the development of manuscript illumination throughout Northern Europe. The sophisticated governmental system that Athelstan created during his reign represented one of his most enduring contributions to English political development, building upon the foundations laid by his grandfather Alfred and his father Edward. He transformed the relatively simple administrative structures of early Wessex into a complex imperial bureaucracy capable of managing relationships across the entire British Isles. The documentary evidence for this transformation can be seen most clearly in the remarkable series of royal charters produced during Athelstan's reign, particularly those created by the mysterious scribe known to historians as Athelstan. The work of this individual, who was responsible for drafting virtually all royal documents between 928 and 935, reveals the existence of a sophisticated writing office that operated according to established procedures and maintained detailed Records of governmental activities. The charters, produced by Athelstan, were notable for their consistency, complexity, and comprehensive detail, unlike earlier Anglo-Saxon documents, which often provided only basic information about the transaction being recorded. These new charters included elaborate witness lists that documented exactly who was present at each royal assembly, detailed dating clauses that established precise chronologies for royal activities, and sophisticated legal formulas that ensured the validity of each grant or judgment. This systematic approach to record-keeping served multiple purposes that extended far beyond mere administrative convenience. It enabled the royal government to maintain accurate records of land ownership, tax obligations, and legal precedents across an enormous territory. It provided mechanisms for ensuring that royal commands were transmitted accurately to distant provinces. Most importantly, it created a documentary foundation for the unified legal and administrative system that Athelstan was attempting to establish throughout his territories. That the expansion of royal administration during Athelstan's reign also involved the creation of new categories of officials responsible for implementing royal policy at the local level. The traditional Anglo-Saxon system of aldermen was expanded and systematized, with these regional governors receiving enhanced authority over larger territories, while remaining accountable to the central government for their performance. Beneath the aldermen, a new class of royal officials emerged to handle the day-to-day administration of justice and the collection of royal revenues. These reeves, as they were called, were typically drawn from local populations but received their authority directly from the crown, creating a chain of command that linked the royal court to every corner of the kingdom. The integration of formerly independent rulers into this administrative system represented one of Athelstan's most innovative achievements. Welsh kings and Scottish nobles who had submitted to English overlordship were incorporated into the governmental framework as subordinate but autonomous authorities, responsible for maintaining order in their own territories while acknowledging ultimate English supremacy. This system of federated administration anticipated many of the techniques that would be used by later imperial powers to govern diverse populations across vast territories. By respecting local customs and traditions while establishing common standards for justice and administration, Athelstan created a model for imperial governance that balanced efficiency with legitimacy. The transformation of English coinage during Athelstan's reign provides compelling evidence for the systematic nature of his imperial project and his understanding of the symbolic dimensions of royal authority. The coins produced during his final years were not merely instruments of commerce, but powerful tools of political communication that proclaimed his achievements to literate and illiterate subjects alike. The most significant innovation in coinage was the introduction of the crowned bust type, which showed the king wearing an actual crown rather than the traditional Anglo-Saxon helmet. This iconographic change reflected continental influences, particularly from the Carolingian and Byzantine traditions that emphasized the sacred nature of kingship, while also demonstrating Athelstan's claims to imperial status. The legends that accompanied these royal portraits were equally innovative, proclaiming Athelstan as Rex Totius Britanniae, king of all Britain in letters that surrounded his crowned image. These inscriptions served multiple purposes. They asserted his imperial claims to anyone capable of reading Latin. They provided a standardized formula that could be used across his entire realm, and they created a visual association between the king's image and his territorial ambitions. The distribution of these coins throughout Athelstan's territories reveals the extent and effectiveness of his administrative control. Mints operated in virtually every major town from Cornwall to Northumberland, each producing coins according to standardized designs and weights that facilitated commerce while demonstrating royal authority. The consistency of these productions suggests a level of governmental coordination that had never before been achieved in Anglo-Saxon England. Perhaps most significantly, the coinage system established during Athelstan's reign provided a foundation for the monetary reforms that would make later Anglo-Saxon England one of the most economically advanced regions in medieval Europe. The standards of weight and purity that he established continued to govern English coinage for centuries, while the network of mints that he created facilitated the commercial development that would make England a major economic power. The political implications of Athelstan's monetary system extended far beyond its immediate economic functions. By establishing uniform coinage throughout his realm, he created a powerful symbol of political unity that reinforced his other administrative innovations. Every commercial transaction conducted with royal coins reminded participants of their common allegiance to the English crown, while the imperial titles proclaimed on these coins asserted Athelstan's claims to authority over all of Britain. The last years of Athelstan's reign were marked by a serenity and cultural achievement that stood in sharp contrast to the military struggles of his earlier career. Having secured his realm against external threats and established the administrative foundations for effective governance, he was able to devote increasing attention to the scholarly and religious pursuits that had always been close to his heart. The royal court at Winchester during this period became a center of learning and culture that rivaled the greatest achievements of the Carolingian Renaissance. Scholars from across Europe gathered to participate in intellectual discussions that ranged from theological speculation to practical problems of governance, while artists and craftsmen produced works that demonstrated the cultural sophistication of Athelstan's kingdom. The king's personal involvement in these activities continued to be extensive, with contemporary sources describing him as an active participant in scholarly debates and a generous patron of artistic endeavors. His collection of books and relics continued to grow through purchase, diplomatic gift, and commissioning of new works, creating a treasury of cultural artifacts that enhanced England's prestige throughout the Christian world. Perhaps most importantly, the intellectual foundations laid during these peaceful years would prove crucial for the cultural achievements of Athelstan's successors. The scholars trained at his court became the leaders of the Benedictine reform movement that would transform English monasticism during the later 10th century, while the artistic traditions established at Winchester influenced the development of English culture for generations to come. The question of succession remained the one unresolved challenge of Athelstan's later years. His decision never to marry or produce legitimate heirs created a potential crisis that threatened to undo all of his achievements if not properly managed. The king appears to have recognized this problem and worked carefully to ensure that his half-brother Edmund would be accepted as his successor. But the transition of power in medieval kingdoms was never guaranteed, regardless of how carefully it might be planned. Despite these concerns about the future, Athelstan's final years were characterized by a sense of achievement and fulfillment that reflected his understanding of what he had accomplished. From a contested prince struggling to establish his legitimacy, he had transformed himself into the first true king of England, the creator of an imperial system that encompassed the entire British Isles, and the patron of a cultural renaissance that had elevated his kingdom to unprecedented heights of achievement. On October 27, 939, as autumn painted the English countryside in shades of gold and crimson, Athelstan breathed his last at the royal manor of Gloucester, bringing to an end one of the most remarkable reigns in medieval European history. The king who had entered the world under mysterious circumstances some 45 years earlier departed it as the undisputed ruler of an empire that stretched from the English Channel to the Scottish Highlands, from the Welsh mountains to the north seacoast. The circumstances of Athelstan's death were as peaceful as his final years had been triumphant. Unlike many medieval kings who died violently in battle or fell victim to political conspiracy, he appears to have succumbed to natural illness. Surrounded by the courtiers and churchmen who had served him throughout his long reign, the calm dignity of his passing seemed to reflect the security and stability that his victories had brought to England after decades of uncertainty and conflict. The king's choice of burial site reflected both his personal piety and his understanding of the symbolic importance of royal death rituals, rather than following the tradition of his predecessors, who had been interred at Winchester among the ancient tombs of the West Saxon kings. Athelstan chose to be buried at Malmesbury Abbey in Wiltshire, the monastery that he had patronized throughout his reign and which housed the tomb of St. Aldhelm, the 7th century scholar saint who had been one of the intellectual fathers of Anglo-Saxon Christianity. This decision to break with royal burial traditions was deeply significant, reflecting Athelstan's vision of himself not merely as another West Saxon king, but as the founder of a new imperial dynasty that transcended the traditional boundaries of tribal kingship. By choosing Malmesbury as his final resting place, he was associating himself with the intellectual and spiritual traditions that had guided his reign, while creating a new sacred site for the monarchy he had created. The funeral ceremony itself was conducted with all the elaborate ritual that befitted the passing of England's first king. According to the account provided by William of Malmesbury, who wrote 2 centuries later but drew on sources contemporary with the events he described, the many relics that Athelstan had collected during his reign were carried before his coffin as it was brought to its final resting place. The Holy Lance, fragments of the True Cross, and the countless other sacred treasures that had validated his spiritual authority accompanied him to the grave, creating a procession that demonstrated the international connections and cultural achievements of his remarkable reign. The king's body was laid to rest with elaborate grave goods that reflected both his royal status and his personal interests. Golden ornaments and precious jewelry proclaimed his earthly authority, while the books and relics that had been so important to him during life accompanied him into death. William of Malmesbury's description of the burial includes the memorable detail that Athelstan's fair hair, beautifully intertwined with gold threads, remained perfectly preserved when the tomb was opened during renovations to the Abbey church. 2 centuries later, the death of Athelstan created an immediate crisis that tested the stability of the imperial system he had spent his entire reign constructing. Despite the careful preparations that had been made for his succession, the transition from one king to another was always a moment of vulnerability in medieval monarchies, particularly when the inheritance involved territories as diverse and recently conquered as those that comprised Athelstan's realm. The succession fell to Edmund, Athelstan's half-brother and the son of Edward the Elder by his third wife, Edgifu. Born around 921, Edmund was still a young man of barely 18 when he inherited the most powerful kingdom in the British Isles. But he had the advantage of having participated in the victory at Brunanburh and of having been carefully prepared for his future role during the peaceful years of Athelstan's later reign. Despite these preparations, the new king immediately faced challenges that demonstrated the fragility of the imperial system that his predecessor had created. News of Athelstan's death traveled quickly throughout the British Isles, reaching enemies who had been waiting for just such an opportunity to reverse the verdicts that military defeat had imposed upon them. The most immediate threat came from Olaf Guthrason, the Dublin king whose defeat at Brunanburh had not diminished his ambitions to reclaim Norse power in northern England. Learning of Athelstan's death, Olaf quickly assembled a new expedition and crossed the Irish Sea to assert his claims to the throne of York, calculating that the inexperience of the new English king would provide opportunities that had been impossible. During Athelstan's lifetime, the people of York and Northumbria, many of whom had never fully accepted Anglo-Saxon rule despite their formal submission, welcomed Olaf's return with enthusiasm that demonstrated the limitations of Athelstan's imperial achievement. Despite 2 decades of English administration, cultural and ethnic loyalties remained powerful forces that could reassert themselves whenever political circumstances seemed favorable. Edmund's response to this crisis revealed both the strengths and weaknesses that he had inherited from his brother's reign. The administrative and military systems that Athelstan had created provided mechanisms for rapid mobilization of English resources, while the loyalty of southern populations remained secure. But the loss of Northumbria demonstrated that imperial authority depended heavily on the personal prestige and military reputation of individual rulers, qualities that could not easily be transferred from one king to another. The collapse of English authority in the north was followed by renewed Welsh restlessness, as local rulers tested the resolve of the new king and sought opportunities to reduce the burden of tribute and submission that Athelstan had imposed. Scottish kings, despite Constantine's defeat and submission, began to probe for weaknesses in the English defensive system that might be exploited to reclaim territories or influence that had been lost. Despite the immediate challenges that followed Athelstan's death, the fundamental achievements of his reign proved more durable than his contemporary enemies had hoped. The administrative systems he had created, the legal traditions he had established, and the cultural foundations he had laid continued to influence English development long after his personal authority had passed into history. Edmund's eventual success in reconquering Northumbria and re-establishing English authority throughout the former boundaries of Athelstan's kingdom demonstrated the institutional strength that the first king of England had built into his imperial system. While individual territories might rebel during periods of royal weakness, the underlying unity that Athelstan had created proved capable of restoration under determined leadership. Perhaps more importantly, the concept of English unity that Athelstan had established through conquest became an accepted part of political discourse that could never again be entirely abandoned. Future kings might lose control of particular regions through military defeat or political incompetence, but the idea that England was naturally a single kingdom under a single ruler had been permanently established in the consciousness of its people. The cultural achievements of Athelstan's reign proved equally enduring, with the intellectual traditions established at his court providing the foundation for the remarkable flowering of English learning that characterized the later 10th and early 11th centuries. The scholars who had been trained in his household became the leaders of the Benedictine reform movement, while the artistic traditions established at Winchester influenced the development of English manuscript illumination and metalwork for generations to come. The international connections that Athelstan had cultivated also outlived his personal reign, with the marriage alliances he had negotiated creating lasting bonds between the English royal house and the great dynasties of continental Europe. These relationships would prove crucial for England's future development, providing diplomatic support during periods of crisis and facilitating the cultural exchange that enriched English civilization. Most fundamentally, Athelstan's reign established the precedent and provided the institutional framework for the creation of the medieval English state that would become one of the most successful and influential political systems in European history. The balance between central authority and local autonomy that he achieved, the integration of diverse populations under common legal and administrative systems, and the cultural synthesis that he fostered all became permanent features of English political life. The historical reputation of Athelstan himself underwent various transformations in the centuries following his death, reflecting the changing perspectives and priorities of successive generations. overshadowed during the Middle Ages by the more dramatic achievements of his grandfather Alfred. He was largely forgotten during the early modern period when English historians focused primarily on the Norman conquest and its aftermath. Only in recent decades have historians begun to recognize the true significance of Athelstan's achievements and his crucial role in the formation of the English nation. Modern scholarship has revealed the sophistication of his governmental systems, the extent of his cultural patronage, and the lasting influence of his imperial vision on the subsequent development of British history. As we reach the end of our gentle journey through the remarkable life and reign of Athelstan, the first king of England, we find ourselves in the peaceful abbey of Mumsbury, where his mortal remains have rested for more than 1,000 years. The empty tomb that marks his resting place serves as a fitting symbol for a king whose greatest achievements were not the monuments he built, but the institutions he created, and the unity he forged from the scattered kingdoms of a divided past. In the soft candlelight of the medieval abbey, surrounded by the stone effigies of saints and scholars, we can still sense the presence of the remarkable man who transformed himself from a contested prince into the architect of English nationhood. His story reminds us that the greatest victories are often won not through dramatic gestures, but through patient persistence. That lasting achievements require not just military skill, but also wisdom, diplomacy, and the vision to see beyond immediate challenges to distant possibilities. The England that Athelstan created through 2 decades of careful statecraft would outlive not just his own reign, but all the kingdoms and empires that have risen and fallen since his time. The legal traditions he established still influence English law today. The administrative innovations he pioneered provided the foundation for parliamentary government. The cultural synthesis he fostered helped create the distinctive English civilization that would eventually spread around the world. But perhaps, most importantly, Athelstan's story demonstrates the power of individual determination and vision to shape the course of history. From the mysterious circumstances of his birth, through the political struggles of his youth, to the imperial triumph of his maturity, every phase of his life was marked by challenges that might have defeated a lesser man. Yet through patience, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to his vision of a united England, he transformed not just his own destiny, but the destiny of an entire nation. As sleep begins to carry you away on this peaceful night, dear listener, rest knowing that you have witnessed one of the great, transformative stories in human history, the tale of how scattered kingdoms became a nation, how tribal warfare gave way to imperial peace, and how one man's vision became the foundation for a civilization that would influence the entire world. The bells of Mumsbury Abbey still ring across the English countryside, their gentle sound echoing through the centuries to remind us of the king who chose scholarship over warfare, diplomacy over conquest, and unity over division. In that timeless melody, we can hear the peaceful conclusion of our journey with Athelstan, the first king of England, whose greatest victory was not won on any battlefield, but in the patient work of building a kingdom that would endure long after its creator had passed into the gentle sleep of eternity. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that in the story of Athelstan, we have witnessed not just the biography of a remarkable king, but the birth of a nation. From the ashes of Roman Britain, through the chaos of the Viking Age, to the dawn of a unified England, we have traveled together through one of history's great transformations. The boy who received golden gifts from Alfred the Great became the man who gave England the gift of unity, and in that unity lay the seeds of all the greatness that would follow. In his tomb at Mumsbury, surrounded by the relics he collected and the manuscripts he commissioned, Athelstan sleeps the eternal sleep of those whose work outlives their mortal frame. The empire he built may have faced challenges, but the idea of England that he created proved indestructible. surviving conquest and civil war, reformation and revolution, to inspire and guide the English people through 1,000 years of triumph and trial. And so we close our peaceful chronicle of England's first king, confident that his story will inspire your dreams with visions of courage rewarded, patience vindicated, and wisdom triumphant. In the gentle darkness of sleep, you may find yourself walking the halls of Winchester, where scholars debated theology and philosophy, or standing on the ramparts of York as Athelstan's banners first flew over that ancient city, or kneeling in the treasury at Malmesbury, where golden reliquaries held fragments of sacred history. Sweet dreams, dear listener, and may the legacy of Athelstan, builder of kingdoms, patron of learning, and architect of English unity, guide you gently into the peaceful rest that concludes all earthly journeys. The first king of England has found his eternal peace, and in that peace England itself was born. By the early 930s, Athelstan had achieved a position of authority in Britain that no ruler had enjoyed since the withdrawal of the Roman legions 5 centuries earlier. His conquest of York had unified England under a single crown for the first time in living memory. His diplomatic triumphs at Eamont and Hereford had established his overlordship over Wales and secured Scottish recognition of his expanded realm. His international marriage alliances had elevated England to the status of a major European power, worthy of association with the greatest continental dynasties. Yet success, particularly success on such a scale, inevitably bred new challenges and new enemies. The very magnitude of Athelstan's achievements had alarmed neighbouring rulers who feared that their own independence might be next on the list of territories marked for absorption into the expanding English monarchy. Scottish kings worried that Athelstan's control of Northumbria was merely the first step in a campaign to extend English rule to the Highland borders. Welsh princes, despite their formal submissions, harboured resentments that could easily be inflamed if the right opportunity arose. Most dangerously of all, the Norse kingdoms of Ireland remained unconvinced that Athelstan's triumph was permanent, and their rulers continued to plot for opportunities to reclaim the throne of York that they considered rightfully theirs. The delicate balance of power that had emerged from the diplomatic settlements of the late 920s depended heavily on Athelstan's ability to project strength while avoiding actions that might drive his potential enemies into desperate alliance against him. For several years, he managed this balancing act with considerable skill, using a combination of generous patronage, strategic marriages, and occasional displays of military force to maintain the submission of his vassals while deterring more ambitious challenges to his authority. But by 934, this careful equilibrium was beginning to break down under the pressure of events that neither Athelstan nor his enemies could entirely control. The most immediate trigger for the crisis that would engulf northern Britain was the mysterious fate of Edwin, Athelstan's half-brother and longtime rival for the throne of Wessex. Edwin had remained a potential threat throughout the early years of Athelstan's reign, a focus for those West Saxon nobles who had never fully accepted the legitimacy of their merchant-trained king, though he had been excluded from any meaningful role in government and had witnessed the gradual consolidation of his half-brother's power. Edwin had never formally renounced his claims to the throne or accepted a subordinate position within the royal family. The exact circumstances of Edwin's death in 933 remain one of the most controversial episodes in Athelstan's reign. According to the official account, as recorded in continental sources, Edwin died in a shipwreck while attempting to flee England following some unspecified disturbance in the kingdom. The implication was that he had been involved in a failed conspiracy against Athelstan's rule and had chosen exile rather than face the consequences of discovery. But this sanitized version of events satisfied few contemporary observers, and modern historians have expressed considerable skepticism about its accuracy. The timing of Edwin's death, just as Athelstan was preparing for his most ambitious military campaigns, seemed too convenient to be entirely coincidental. More troubling still were reports that Edwin had been set adrift in a small boat without provisions, a method of execution that would have allowed Athelstan to eliminate his rival while maintaining plausible deniability about the cause of death, whether Edwin died through natural misfortune, deliberate murder, or something in between. His fate had profound consequences for the political situation in northern Britain. Scottish and Irish rulers, who had been considering resistance to Athelstan's imperial ambitions, could now point to Edwin's death as evidence of the English king's ruthless determination to eliminate all opposition. The removal of this potential alternative claimant to the English throne also meant that any future challenge to Athelstan's rule would have to come from outside his kingdom rather than from internal dissent. Perhaps most importantly, Edwin's death appears to have freed Athelstan from the domestic political constraints that had previously limited his freedom of action. With no credible rival claimant to worry about, and his authority firmly established throughout his own dominions, he could afford to take the kind of military risks that might have been unthinkable while his own succession remained disputed. The target he chose for his demonstration of imperial power was Scotland, the kingdom that had most consistently challenged his claims to overlordship over all of Britain. Despite Constantine II's formal submission at Eamont 7 years earlier, relations between the two kingdoms had remained tense, marked by border incidents, competing claims to influence in the disputed territories of northern England, and the underlying Scottish fear that Athelstan's ultimate goal was the complete conquest of their homeland. The proximate cause of Athelstan's decision to invade Scotland in 934 remains unclear, though several plausible explanations have been advanced by historians. The most likely trigger was Constantine's violation of some aspect of the Eamont Agreement, perhaps through his failure to provide promised military assistance, or his interference in the affairs of Northumbrian nobles who had submitted to English rule. Contemporary sources are frustratingly vague about the specific justification for the campaign. Though the 12th century chronicler John of Worcester claimed that Constantine had broken his treaty with Athelstan, this explanation has the virtue of providing a legal basis for what was essentially an act of aggression. But it tells us nothing about the nature of Constantine's alleged violation or the circumstances that led to the breakdown of their relationship. More convincing, perhaps, is the argument that Athelstan's invasion was motivated less by any specific Scottish provocation than by his recognition that his imperial claims would never be taken seriously until they had been tested and validated through military action. The diplomatic submissions at Eamont and Hereford had established his theoretical overlordship, but theory would remain meaningless until it was backed by demonstrated military superiority. The military expedition that Athelstan assembled for his Scottish campaign was the largest and most diverse army that had ever marched under Anglo-Saxon banners. The king understood that success would require not just numerical superiority, but also a demonstration of the unity and loyalty of his various subject peoples, and he accordingly summoned contingents from every corner of his imperial realm. The core of the army consisted of the household troops and professional warriors who had served Athelstan throughout his career, men whose loyalty was personal rather than territorial, and who could be relied upon to fight effectively regardless of the political complexities of the campaign. These veterans were supplemented by the traditional furred levies of Wessex and Mercia, farmers and townsmen called to military service by ancient obligations that bound every free man to defend his kingdom when summoned by the crown. But the most remarkable aspect of Athelstan's army was the presence of substantial contingents from the recently conquered territories and client kingdoms that now acknowledged his overlordship. Danish nobles from the former Danelaw brought their own retainers to serve under the English banner, demonstrating their commitment to their new allegiance. Welsh kings who had submitted at Hereford arrived with their warbands, fulfilling their treaty obligations while also proving their continued loyalty to the English crown. Among the Welsh contingents was Hywel Dda of Deheubarth, the most powerful of the Welsh rulers and a king whose presence added considerable prestige to Athelstan's expedition. Hywel was accompanied by Eadwal Fiel of Gwenith, Morgan ap Owain of Gwent, and Chudwer ap Griffrey of Britanniae, creating an unprecedented display of Welsh unity under English leadership. Perhaps most significantly, the army also included 6 Danish earls from eastern England, former enemies who now served as some of Athelstan's most trusted lieutenants. Their participation in a campaign against Scotland demonstrated the success of his policies of integration and reconciliation, showing that former adversaries could become loyal allies when treated with appropriate respect and generosity. Ecclesiastical component of the expedition was equally impressive, with 18 bishops accompanying the army to provide spiritual support and to witness the king's victories. The presence of so many senior churchmen served multiple purposes. It emphasized the Christian character of Athelstan's cause, provided opportunities for diplomatic contact with Scottish religious leaders, and ensured that the campaign would be properly recorded by reliable witnesses. The logistics of assembling and moving such a large and diverse force presented enormous challenges. The king's collection, housed in specially constructed treasuries at Winchester and other royal centres, became legendary throughout medieval Europe for both its size and the remarkable provenance of its contents. Agents working on Athelstan's behalf travelled from Ireland to Byzantium, from Rome to the monasteries of Germany, seeking artifacts that could enhance the spiritual prestige of the English crown. The most famous items in the royal collection were those claimed to have direct connections to the life and death of Jesus Christ. The Holy Lance, said to be the spear that pierced Christ's side during the crucifixion, became the centerpiece of the Winchester treasury. According to the accounts that have survived, this artifact was presented to Athelstan by Hugh the Great of France, as part of the diplomatic negotiations that led to the marriage of the English king's sister to the Frankish duke. Fragments, supposedly, from the true cross were mounted in ornate reliquaries crafted by the finest goldsmiths in England and continental Europe. These precious objects were not merely devotional aids, but powerful political symbols that demonstrated Athelstan's connections to the sacred history of Christianity and his worthiness to rule over a Christian people. The collection also included relics associated with the broader history of Christian martyrdom and sanctity. The arm of St. Bartholomew, acquired through diplomatic negotiations with Roman ecclesiastical authorities, was believed to possess particular powers of protection against enemies. Hair claimed to belong to St. Mary Magdalene was housed in a crystal reliquary that became one of the wonders of the Winchester treasury, attracting pilgrims from across Europe who came to venerate these sacred remains. Perhaps most importantly for Athelstan's political purposes, the collection included numerous relics associated with specifically English saints whose cults helped to legitimize his rule over the former Danish territories of northern England. His devotion to St. Cuthbert, the 7th century Northumbrian saint, was particularly pronounced, reflecting his understanding that religious legitimacy was as important as military conquest in securing the loyalty of his northern subjects. The magnificent manuscript of Bede's Life of St. Cuthbert, that Athelstan commissioned for presentation to the saint's shrine at Chester Street, represents one of the masterpieces of Anglo-Saxon book production. The volume includes what may be the earliest surviving portrait of an English king, showing Athelstan himself presenting the completed work to St. Cuthbert. in a composition that served both artistic and political purposes. The authentication and acquisition of these relics required a sophisticated network of diplomatic and commercial relationships that extended across medieval Europe. Bishops and abbots served as Athelstan's agents in this spiritual marketplace, using their ecclesiastical connections to identify potential acquisitions and negotiate the complex transactions that brought these treasures to England. Cenwalh, Bishop of Worcester, emerges from the surviving sources as one of the most important figures in this network, spending considerable time traveling through Germany and France on missions that combined ecclesiastical business with relic hunting. His connections to the reformed monasteries of the continent provided access to treasures that might otherwise have been impossible to obtain, while his diplomatic skills ensured that these acquisitions enhanced rather than damaged England's relationships with foreign powers. The victory at Brunanburh not only secured Athelstan's position within the British Isles, but also elevated England to unprecedented prominence in European political affairs. Foreign rulers who had previously viewed the island kingdom as a peripheral concern now recognized it as a major power whose friendship could be valuable and whose enmity could be dangerous. This transformation in England's international status created new opportunities for diplomatic engagement that Athelstan exploited with characteristic skill and sophistication. The marriage alliances that he had negotiated during his earlier years now bore fruit as the royal houses of France and Germany found themselves dealing with a brother whose military prowess and political acumen commanded respect throughout the Christian world. The most significant of these relationships was with the emerging Ottonian dynasty in East Francia, where Athelstan's sister, Egith, had become queen through her marriage to Otto, the future Holy Roman Emperor. This connection provided England with a reliable ally in the complex political struggles that were reshaping continental Europe, while also giving Athelstan access to the intellectual and cultural resources of the German Church. The practical benefits of this alliance became apparent during the succession crisis that convulsed the Western Frankish kingdom throughout the 930s. Louis IV, Athelstan's nephew through his half-sister, Idgifu's marriage to Charles the Simple, had spent much of his youth at the English court before reclaiming his father's throne in 936. This personal connection created obligations of mutual support that drew England directly into continental political affairs for the first time since the Carolingian period. Athelstan's support for Louis's cause included not just diplomatic recognition, but also practical military assistance, including the provision of ships and troops for campaigns against rebellious French nobles. This intervention demonstrated England's emergence as a power capable of influencing events far beyond its own borders, marking a dramatic departure from the isolation that had characterized the island kingdom during the Viking Age. The king's reputation as a patron of learning and culture also attracted international attention, with scholars and artists from across Europe seeking employment at his court. The intellectual ferment created by this gathering of talent produced works of poetry, theology, and historical writing that enhanced England's cultural prestige, while contributing to the broader development of medieval European learning. Perhaps most remarkably, Athelstan's court became a place of refuge for royal exiles and displaced persons from across the continent. Alan II of Brittany received English support in his successful campaign to reclaim his duchy from Viking conquerors, while various German and French nobles found sanctuary at Winchester when political circumstances in their homelands became unfavorable. This policy of providing assistance to legitimate rulers who had been displaced by usurpers or foreign conquerors served multiple diplomatic purposes. It demonstrated Athelstan's commitment to the principle of legitimate monarchy, potentially deterring challenges to his own authority. It created networks of obligation and gratitude that could be activated when English interests required support. Most importantly, it established England as a defender of Christian civilization against pagan barbarism, a role that enhanced the kingdom's prestige throughout medieval Europe. The intellectual achievements of Athelstan's court during the final decade of his reign represented a renaissance of learning that would have profound consequences for the future development of English culture. The international community of scholars that gathered at Winchester created a synthesis of classical, patristic, and contemporary learning that established new standards for intellectual achievement throughout Northern Europe. The king's personal involvement in these scholarly activities went far beyond mere patronage to include active participation in the intellectual life of his court. Contemporary sources suggest that he was not only literate in Latin, but also capable of engaging in sophisticated theological and philosophical discussions with the learned men who served him. This intellectual engagement reflected the influence of his early education under Alfred the Great's scholars, as well as his own natural curiosity and intelligence. The library that Athelstan assembled at Winchester became one of the most comprehensive collections of its time, containing works that ranged from classical philosophy and literature to contemporary theology and historical writing. The king's agents systematically acquired manuscripts from monasteries and scriptoriums across Europe, creating a repository of learning that attracted scholars from distant lands and facilitated intellectual exchange on an unprecedented scale. Among the most notable figures associated with Athelstan's court was Israel the grammarian, a polymath whose mastery of Greek as well as Latin made him one of the most learned men of his generation. Under Israel's influence, the Winchester Scriptorium produced works that combined classical literary techniques with Christian theological insights, creating a distinctive style of learned writing that would influence English scholarship for centuries to come. The court also became a center for the production of illuminated manuscripts that ranked among the masterpieces of medieval art. The combination of English artistic traditions with continental techniques and materials created works of extraordinary beauty and sophistication that demonstrated the cultural achievements of Athelstan's reign to contemporary and future observers. Perhaps most importantly, the scholarly activities at Athelstan's court laid the intellectual foundations for the Benedictine reform movement that would transform English monasticism during the reigns of his successors.